There is a place on this earth where the human story did not just begin, where it never stopped, where a bloodline has been running forward, unbroken, through ice ages and extinctions and rising seas and 50,000 years of unwitnessed human experience, carrying inside it things that science is only now learning how to see. The textbooks gave you two sentences: a people, a continent, the oldest culture. They left out the part that matters. They left out the 65,000-year bloodline with genetic signals that have no source. The oral traditions that preserved accurate geology across 12,000 years. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the dark spaces between the stars. The ghost population in the genome. The connection to Amazonian DNA that should not be there. They left out the story. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. There is a place on this planet where time does not behave the way we were taught, where the ground beneath your feet holds memories so ancient that the very concept of ancient begins to feel inadequate, where people walk today who carry in their blood a genetic signature so old, so continuous, so unbroken that modern science keeps running its instruments twice just to confirm the results are real. That place is Australia, and the bloodline belongs to the Aboriginal people. You probably learned something about them in school. A sentence, maybe two. Indigenous Australians. Oldest living culture. Hunter-gatherers. The lesson moved on quickly, the way lessons always do when the subject matter threatens to rewrite everything else on the curriculum. But here is what your textbook left out. The Aboriginal people of Australia carry in their DNA a lineage so deep it predates the out-of-Africa migrations that gave rise to every other population on Earth. When geneticists first began sequencing their genomes in earnest, what came back from the lab sent researchers back to their models because the models were wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. The kind of wrong that means everything built on top of those models needs to be revisited too. We are talking about a bloodline that stretches back more than 65,000 years of continuous presence on a single continent. A lineage that survived ice ages, mega droughts, sea level rises that swallowed coastlines, and volcanic winters that darkened the skies of the entire southern hemisphere. A people whose oral traditions contain accurate descriptions of geological events that science only recently confirmed happened. Who mapped the stars with a precision that modern astronomers have had to sit with for a long time before admitting what they were looking at. And buried inside their genome, scientists found something that still does not have a clean explanation. A genetic signal from a population that has no known fossil record. A ghost lineage. People who lived and died and shaped the human story without leaving a single bone we have ever found. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Because what we are about to walk through together is not a simple story of early migration and gradual settlement. It is something far stranger. A 65,000-year mystery written in living human blood, encoded in the DNA of people who never needed us to validate their history because they were carrying it inside them the entire time. Let us start at the very beginning. Not the beginning of Australia as a nation, and not even the beginning of Australian prehistory as it is usually taught. Let us start at the beginning of the human story itself, because that is the only place from which you can properly understand what makes Aboriginal genetic heritage so extraordinary and so difficult to explain. Around 300,000 years ago, in what is now the continent of Africa, anatomically modern humans were walking around in forms almost identical to you and me. The same skull shape, the same brain volume, the same capacity for language, planning, abstract thought, and everything that we tend to think of as distinctly human. They were us. They just did not have writing or agriculture or metal or any of the scaffolding that civilization would eventually build around the basic human package. For hundreds of thousands of years, these people lived, moved, loved, competed, and died across the African continent. Their populations rose and fell with the climate. They faced droughts that turned grasslands to desert and wet periods that pushed forest back over plains. They adapted, every generation filtering the genetic lottery a little differently. the survivors passing on a slightly updated version of the human blueprint to the next. And then, somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 years ago, something happened. A small group of people left. Not an army. Not a migration of thousands. The genetic evidence suggests it may have been as few as a few hundred individuals, possibly even fewer, who crossed out of Africa and into the wider world. These were the ancestors of every non-African human being alive today. Every European, every East Asian, every Indigenous American, every Middle Eastern population, every South Asian group. All of us, outside of Africa, trace our lineage back to that small founding group. This is called the out-of-Africa bottleneck, and it left a signature in the DNA of every non-African population that geneticists can still read today. A narrowing. A reduction in genetic diversity relative to African populations that never went through that filter. Now here is where the Aboriginal Australian story begins to diverge from everything else. Because the people who eventually reached Australia were among the very first wave out of Africa. And once they arrived on that continent, they stayed. They did not keep moving. They did not get absorbed back into other populations through later migrations. They sat on that landmass for tens of thousands of years in a kind of genetic isolation that is almost without parallel anywhere else in the world. The result is a lineage so old and so continuous that when researchers began comparing Aboriginal Australian genomes to the rest of the world, the numbers came out in ways that seemed almost incompatible with conventional timelines. The year 2011 changed everything. That was when a team of researchers published a landmark genetic analysis using a strand of hair collected from an Aboriginal Australian man in the early 20th century. The hair had been sitting in a museum archive for decades, preserved almost accidentally, waiting for the technology to catch up to the questions it could answer. When the team sequenced the DNA inside that strand of hair and compared it to genetic databases from populations around the world, the results came back with a date that stopped the room. The Aboriginal Australian lineage diverged from the ancestors of all other non-African populations somewhere between 62,000 and 75,000 years ago. Let that settle for a moment. The people whose descendants still live in Australia today were already on their way to that continent before the ancestors of every other non-African population had fully separated from each other. Before East Asians and Europeans and South Asians began diverging into their respective lineages, the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians had already split off and were moving through a world that no human being had walked before. They reached Australia, the genetic models suggest, somewhere between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. There are archaeological sites on the continent, particularly in the south, where the dates have come back older than anyone expected. Charcoal from ancient fires, pigment from cave walls, ochre processing tools, all of it sitting deeper in the sediment layers than the standard models said humans should have been there. Some of those dates have been contested, picked over, reanalyzed. That is science doing its job, but even the conservative estimates are staggering. 50,000 years of continuous presence on a single landmass. 50,000 years of people being born and dying and passing their knowledge and their blood to children who did the same. Generation after generation after generation in a chain so long that if you tried to count the individual lives it represents, you would run out of patience long before you ran out of ancestors. Now, consider what the rest of the world looked like during that 50,000-year span. When Aboriginal Australians were already established on their continent, the Neanderthals were still alive in Europe. The woolly mammoth was still alive everywhere. Agriculture had not been invented. There were no cities, no writing, no bronze, no iron, no wheel. The populations that would eventually become European civilization were still small bands of hunter-gatherers navigating an Ice Age landscape. Stonehenge would not be built for another 45,000 years. The pyramids were still 53,000 years in the future, and Aboriginal Australians were already here. What does it mean for a culture to be that old? What does it mean for a bloodline to be that continuous? These are not rhetorical questions. They have real implications for how we understand the human story, for what we think culture is capable of preserving, and for what kinds of knowledge can survive across timescales that our civilization cannot even meaningfully conceptualize. Because here is the thing that the history books really do not prepare you for. A culture that has existed for 65,000 years is not just old, it is a technology, an information storage system of almost incomprehensible scale and sophistication. Everything that Western civilization does, with writing, with libraries, with universities, with the internet, Aboriginal Australian culture was doing with song, with story, with ceremony, with landscape. And it was doing it for 10 times longer than writing has existed. The song lines are the most famous example of this, and also the most misunderstood. Most people who have heard the term imagine something poetic, ancient songs about the land, music connected to place, and yes, it is that. But it is also much more specific and much more practical than the poetic framing suggests. The song lines, or dreaming tracks, are a network of invisible pathways that crisscross the entire Australian continent. Every major geographic feature, every water source, every mountain range, every river system, every stretch of coast has a corresponding song. The songs are not metaphors for the landscape. They are maps of the landscape, encoded in a form that can be memorized and transmitted across generations without writing. Sing the right sequence of the song, and you know exactly where the next waterhole is. You know what to expect from the terrain. You know which plants grow where, which animals can be found in which season, which routes are passable in flood season and which are not. The song contains logistical information that would take pages of written text to convey, compressed into a form that survives in human memory across hundreds of generations. The same song that a man learns from his grandfather may have been first composed by an ancestor 30,000 years ago, and it still works. The landscape it describes still matches the song, because landscapes change slowly, and the songs update to accommodate changes when necessary, like a living database with a built-in maintenance system. There is a waterhole in the western desert of Australia. It sits in a low hollow between two red rock outcrops, invisible from more than a few hundred meters away unless you know exactly where to look. The nearest permanent settlement is more than 200 kilometers in any direction. Aboriginal Australians have been singing the location of that waterhole into their songlines for at least 15,000 years, possibly much longer. In the middle of a desert that would kill an unprepared person within days, the knowledge of that waterhole's existence has survived in unbroken oral transmission across more than 600 generations. Let that number land. 600 generations of parents teaching children, elders teaching young adults, the knowledge flowing forward through time without a single piece of written documentation, without a single map on paper, without a single GPS coordinate. Just song, just story, just the human voice passing information from one generation to the next in a chain so long that it reaches back into a time when Europe was buried under ice. This is not primitive. This is a different kind of sophisticated. And it is not the most astonishing thing about what Aboriginal culture has preserved. In 2020, a research paper was published in a geology journal that caused a quiet but significant stir among researchers who work at the intersection of geology, linguistics, and anthropology. The paper analyzed a collection of Aboriginal oral traditions from communities along the coastlines of southern Australia. These stories described events that matched, in remarkable detail, the drowning of coastal landscapes at the end of the last ice age. When the ice age ended, sea levels rose dramatically. In some parts of the world, coastlines retreated inland by hundreds of kilometers as the ice sheets melted and their water poured back into the ocean. This happened between roughly 7,000 and 12,000 years ago, and it permanently reshaped the geography of every continent on Earth. The Aboriginal stories describe this process. They talk about times when the sea was far away from where it is now, when people walked on land that is now ocean floor, when coastlines that are now underwater were lived on and traveled through. The stories encode the approximate direction and rate of the sea's advance in ways that match the geological record with surprising precision. These are not vague myths about a flood. They are geographically specific accounts of coast-by-coast inundation that correlate with what the sediment cores and sea level models tell us about a period that ended 7,000 years ago. 7,000 years ago. The stories were first collected in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when European researchers were doing their early anthropological work on Aboriginal culture. At the time, the researchers noted the strange specificity of the coastal flooding stories, but had no framework for taking them seriously as geological data. The science needed to verify them did not exist yet. When modern geology eventually produced the data to compare against, the match was there. An oral tradition that had been faithfully transmitted for at least 7,000 years, and possibly considerably longer, carrying accurate information about a geological event that happened at the end of the Pleistocene. Think about what that means for the reliability of oral transmission as an information storage system. We tend to assume that stories drift, that they accumulate errors with each retelling, that they are fundamentally unsuited to preserving precise factual information over long timescales. And in many contexts, that assumption is probably correct. But what the Aboriginal Australian evidence suggests is that under the right cultural conditions, with the right structures of transmission, with the right ceremonial reinforcement, oral traditions can preserve accurate information across timescales that make the entire span of written human history look like a brief footnote. If the flooding stories check out against the geology, what else in those oral traditions might be accurate that we have not yet had the tools to verify? And this is the question that starts to pull at you once you begin looking seriously at Aboriginal Australian cultural heritage, not just as anthropology, not just as history, but as data, as a record of human experience across a time span that no other culture on Earth has managed to preserve in continuous, unbroken form. Because here is what makes Aboriginal Australian oral tradition structurally different from the oral traditions of other cultures that we tend to compare it to. Most oral traditions exist alongside written traditions. The Norse sagas were eventually written down. The Homeric epics were eventually transcribed. The Vedas, the oldest of which may go back 3,500 years, were eventually committed to text. In most cases, what we think of as oral tradition is really oral tradition that was eventually rescued by writing. Aboriginal Australian oral tradition was never rescued by writing. It never needed to be. The structures for maintaining it were so robust, the ceremonial reinforcement so consistent, the social consequences of forgetting or distorting so significant that the information survived for tens of thousands of years without any backup system. The backup system was the culture itself, and not just any culture, a culture that had 65,000 years to optimize its own information storage mechanisms, 65,000 years of selecting for the social structures and ceremonial practices and transmission methods that worked, and discarding the ones that led to information loss. What you end up with, after 65,000 years of cultural optimization, is something that looks less like a primitive oral tradition and more like a library. A distributed, living, ceremonially maintained, geographically indexed library spread across a continent the size of the continental United States. Now, we need to talk about the genetics more carefully, because this is where things start to become genuinely difficult to explain within the framework of conventional human prehistory. When the 2011 genetic analysis established the deep divergence of the Aboriginal Australian lineage, it raised an immediate and obvious question. If Aboriginal Australians were among the very first people out of Africa, and if they reached Australia 50 to 65,000 years ago, then what happened to all the other people who must have been moving through that region at roughly the same time? The geography of the early human expansion out of Africa suggests a coastal route. People moved along the southern coastline of what is now the Middle East, through South Asia, through Southeast Asia, and eventually reached the landmass that was then connected to Australia. This route is sometimes called the Southern Dispersal Route, and the genetic evidence broadly supports it as the primary path taken by the first people to leave Africa and spread east. But here is the puzzle. If people were moving along this coastal route, and if some of them eventually reached Australia, then you would expect to find genetic connections between Aboriginal Australians and the populations that lived in between. South Asian populations, Southeast Asian populations, island populations along the route, and you do find some connections. The broad genetic architecture confirms the shared ancestry. What you also find, though, buried deep in the Aboriginal Australian genome, is a signal that does not connect to anything. Researchers call it by different names in different papers. An unknown ancestral population, an archaic admixture signal, a ghost lineage. But what it amounts to is a genetic contribution from a population that has no identified source. Not Neanderthal, though Neanderthal DNA is also present at the expected low levels. Not Denisovan, though Denisovan DNA is also present, and in Aboriginal Australians is actually found at higher levels than in most other non-African populations. This is something else. A third signal, from people we have never found. The Denisovan contribution is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is remarkable in its own right. The Denisovans are a human population that was only discovered in 2010, identified from a fragment of finger bone and 2 teeth found in a cave in Siberia. At the time of discovery, researchers extracted DNA from the bone fragment and found that it represented an entirely new branch of the human family. Not modern humans, not Neanderthals, something else. A separate lineage that had diverged from the common ancestor of both modern humans and Neanderthals hundreds of thousands of years ago, and had been living across Asia during the same period that Neanderthals were living in Europe. The Denisovans interbred with the ancestors of modern humans at some point during the expansions out of Africa. We know this because modern humans carry Denisovan DNA. The highest concentrations of Denisovan ancestry in modern populations are found in Melanesia, in New Guinea, and in Aboriginal Australians, where the Denisovan contribution runs as high as 4 to 6% of the total genome. 4 to 6% of your DNA coming from a population that went extinct somewhere around 50,000 years ago. A population we know almost entirely from a single finger bone, a couple of teeth, and their genetic ghost in the people who carry their inheritance today. That is already extraordinary. That is already a story about the deep and complicated history of our species that should be getting more attention than it does. But the Denisovan signal, remarkable as it is at least identified. We know what it is. We know roughly where those encounters happened, somewhere in Southeast Asia, or the islands between Southeast Asia and Australia, based on the geography of where the highest concentrations appear in modern populations. The third signal is different. The third signal has no identified source. When researchers model the ancestry components of Aboriginal Australian genomes and compare them against every known ancient DNA sample and every known modern population, there is a residual component that does not match anything. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, not any modern human population, not any ancient DNA sample from any archaeological site anywhere in the world. It is the genetic signature of people who left no bones that we have found, no tools we have identified, no sites we have excavated. They existed. They interbred with the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians or their predecessors on the route to Australia. And then they vanished from the record completely, leaving only this faint imprint in the genomes of people living on a continent on the opposite side of the world, from where we tend to look for early human fossils. Ghost lineages are not unique to Aboriginal Australian genetics. Researchers have found similar unexplained signals in other populations, particularly in West Africa, where a ghost lineage appears to have contributed to some modern genomes but has no identified skeletal or archaeological source. The field of ancient DNA research is young enough, and the fossil record patchy enough, that the presence of unidentified ancestral populations is not a surprise to people who work in the field. But the Aboriginal Australian ghost signal is particularly interesting because of its age and because of the context in which it appears. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians were among the first people to leave Africa. They were moving through regions of the world where early human populations had been present for hundreds of thousands of years before the modern human expansion. Homo erectus had been in Southeast Asia for possibly 1.5 million years before modern humans arrived. There were archaic human populations distributed across the islands and coastlines of that region, whose fossil record is fragmentary and whose genetic history is almost entirely unknown. The ghost lineage might represent one of those populations. A Southeast Asian archaic human group that left almost no bones but interbred with the incoming modern humans moving toward Australia, contributing a small but detectable genetic signature that has been carried forward ever since. Or it might represent something else entirely. Some researchers have proposed that the ghost signal in Aboriginal Australian genomes might reflect a very early and now otherwise invisible branch of the modern human expansion out of Africa. A group that left Africa before the main out-of-Africa migration, established themselves somewhere in southern Asia, and then contributed genetically to the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians before themselves disappearing or being absorbed. This would push the timeline of human movement out of Africa back even further than the current consensus. It would mean that there were people outside Africa significantly earlier than we currently acknowledge. People moving through Asia, people possibly reaching islands, people living and dying and contributing their genetics to later populations, all before the main wave that we call the out-of-Africa expansion. It is a hypothesis. The evidence for it is suggestive, but not conclusive. But it is the kind of hypothesis that keeps ancient DNA researchers up at night, because if it is correct, then the history of human movement is considerably more complicated and considerably older than the textbook version. And Aboriginal Australian genetics keeps producing these moments. These places where the standard model says one thing and the data says something slightly different and slightly harder to explain. There is another genetic mystery embedded in the Aboriginal Australian genome that is more recent but no less puzzling. In 2013, a large-scale genetic study found evidence of what the researchers described as gene flow into Australia from India, arriving roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. 4,000 years ago. That is well within the period that we think of as pre-contact, meaning before European colonization and before any documented contact between Australia and the rest of the world. The academic consensus had long held that Australia was essentially isolated after the initial settlement, that no significant population had reached the continent after those first arrivals 50,000+ years ago. But the genetics suggested otherwise. The genetic signal from this study indicated not just the arrival of people from India or a population closely related to Indian populations. It coincided, the researchers noted, with two other things happening in Australia at the same time. The arrival of a new stone tool technology that had not previously been present on the continent, and the first appearance of the dingo. The dingo is a wild dog. It is found throughout Australia and is considered a native species, but it is not native in the deep sense. It is descended from domesticated dogs, and the domestication of dogs happened in mainland Asia, not in Australia. The dingo's ancestors came from somewhere else, from a population that kept dogs, from people who arrived in Australia roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago and brought their tools and their dogs with them, and then, apparently, left a genetic signature in the Aboriginal Australian population before disappearing into it. This was not supposed to have happened. The story of Aboriginal Australian prehistory, as it was understood for most of the 20th century, was one of deep isolation. Arrival 50,000+ years ago, and then the continent sealed itself off from the rest of the world's human story until Europeans arrived in the 17th century. The genetics of the dingo and the stone tools and the Indian genetic signal are telling a different story. One in which Australia was not as isolated as we thought. One in which there were contacts, arrivals, and departures that have not left the kind of archaeological evidence we have been looking for, but have left traces in the genes of the people who were there. What else have we missed? What other contacts, what other arrivals, what other genetic contributions are sitting undetected in genomes we have not yet sequenced or analyses we have not yet run? Before we go further into the genetics, we need to sit with a number that most people, even people who take Australian prehistory seriously, find genuinely difficult to absorb. 65,000 years. It is easy to say, and it is almost impossible to truly feel. We do not have any intuitive sense of time at that scale. The human mind did not evolve to navigate timescales longer than a few generations in any visceral sense. We can understand intellectually that 65,000 years is a very long time, but we cannot feel it the way we feel, the difference between a minute and an hour. So let us try to build a sense of it through comparison. The entirety of recorded human history, from the first Sumerian writing tablets to the device you are watching this on right now, covers approximately 5,000 years. That is the time from the earliest clay tablets with cuneiform marks on them to the present moment, the total span of what we call history. The Aboriginal Australian bloodline is 13 times longer than the entirety of recorded history. The Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the oldest major monuments on Earth, was built approximately 4,500 years ago. When the pyramid was built, Aboriginal Australians had already been on their continent for 60,500 years. They had been there for 13.5 times the age of the pyramid before the pyramid existed. Stonehenge was begun around 5,000 years ago. When Stonehenge was started, the Aboriginal bloodline was already 60,000 years old. Agriculture, the development that most fundamentally changed the human story, began in the Middle East around 12,000 years ago. When the first farmers were planting the first deliberately cultivated grains in the Fertile Crescent, Aboriginal Australians had already been established in Australia for 53,000 years. The last mammoth populations on Earth, isolated on a remote Arctic island, went extinct around 4,000 years ago. By the time those mammoths were dying, Aboriginal Australians had already spent 61,000 years in their country. These comparisons do not fully capture the timescale. Nothing can fully capture it for a human mind that evolved to navigate timescales measured in years and decades, but they begin to give it shape. They begin to communicate that what we are talking about when we talk about the Aboriginal Australian bloodline is not just something very old in the way that Rome is old or ancient Egypt is old. It is old in a way that makes all of those comparisons seem recent. In a way that reaches back to a period when the human world was fundamentally different, when other human species still walked the earth, when the geography of the continents was different, when the megafauna were alive. And through all of that, unbroken, the bloodline running forward, the people passing their knowledge to their children, the songlines being maintained across the land, the stars being watched and their rising noted and the seasons read from their positions. Unbroken across a span of time that makes everything else in human history look like a brief introduction, let us talk about the stars, because the stars are where some of the most startling evidence of Aboriginal Australian sophistication sits. And because it is the area where the gap between how this culture is usually presented and what it actually accomplished is perhaps most dramatic. When most people think about ancient astronomy, they think about the cultures that get credit for it in standard histories. The Babylonians, with their careful records of planetary motion. The Egyptians, with their pyramid alignments. The Maya, with their complex calendar systems. The Greeks, with their systematic mapping of the night sky. These are the civilizations that show up in the history of astronomy, and their contributions are real and genuinely impressive. But they are all working within a written tradition. They are all doing astronomy in the context of a civilization that can record observations and pass them on through text. And the oldest of those written astronomical traditions goes back maybe 5,000 years. Aboriginal Australian astronomical traditions go back 65,000. Not in the same form, not with the same tools, but in a tradition of systematic, careful, multi-generational observation of the night sky that predates the oldest written astronomical records by 10 to 12 times. The Aboriginal Australian night sky is not the same sky that European astronomers mapped. Or rather, it contains the same stars, but it is organized around a fundamentally different set of principles. Western astronomy, and the astronomical traditions of most of the world, builds constellations out of stars. You pick a set of stars, connect them into a pattern, name the pattern, and use it as a landmark in the sky. The star patterns are the primary organizational units. Aboriginal Australian astronomy does something different and in many ways more sophisticated. It builds constellations out of the dark spaces between the stars. Out of the dark clouds of the Milky Way itself, the dense nebulae and dust clouds that interrupt the bright band of the galactic plane. These dark constellations, or dark emu in the sky as some communities describe it, are formed from the shapes of the absence of stars rather than the presence of them. And what makes them remarkable from an astronomical standpoint is that they are, in a real technical sense, harder to perceive than star-based constellations. They require a darker sky. They require more careful observation. They require an understanding of the Milky Way as a structured object, rather than just a bright band of light. And they are functionally connected to seasonal ecology in ways that the star-based constellations of other traditions are not, at least not as directly. The emu in the sky is the most famous example. The dark emu is formed from the Coalsack Nebula and the dark dust lanes of the Milky Way, and its visibility varies with the seasons. When the emu appears in a particular position on the horizon just before dawn, it corresponds to a time when emus on the ground are laying their eggs. This is a food source. Emu eggs are highly nutritious and were an important seasonal food in many parts of Australia. The sky tells you when the eggs are available, not as a rough approximation, as a precise ecological calendar calibrated through tens of thousands of years of observation and cross-referenced with the actual behavior of the animals. This is astronomy in service of survival. It is also astronomy that required a sophistication of observation that most people, when they encounter it for the first time, do not quite know how to categorize because it does not look like what we have been taught to call astronomy. But there is more. Because the sky, in Aboriginal Australian tradition, is not just a calendar and a map. It is a record, a repository of information about events in the deep past that have been encoded in story form and maintained in the astronomical tradition because the sky is permanent in a way that landscapes are not. In 2020, researchers working with Aboriginal elders in parts of South Australia identified stories about a bright star in the night sky. The stories describe the star as having been brighter in the past, as having behaved in unusual ways, as having changed. When the researchers checked these accounts against the known history of the stars in question, they found something striking. The stars the stories described had indeed changed. Some were variable stars whose brightness fluctuates in cycles. Others were part of binary systems whose orbital dynamics affect their apparent brightness over time. The Aboriginal stories contained accurate information about stellar variation, accurate enough to be matched against modern measurements, accurate enough to suggest that the original observations were precise. How long ago were those original observations made? The researchers could not say for certain. The accounts had been transmitted orally for an unknown number of generations. But the precision of the astronomical data encoded in them suggested observations made over long periods of time, with careful attention to change across generations. You cannot observe a star's behavior across multiple human lifetimes from a single observation. You need records. You need transmission. You need generation after generation of watchers, each one noting what the generation before described and checking it against what they see. The songlines and the oral traditions provided that. They were the records, not carved in stone or pressed into clay, but woven into story and ceremony and passed forward through a chain of human memory that stretched back into the deep past. We need to talk about Mungo, because Mungo is where the Australian story first starts to make most conventional archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. Lake Mungo is a dry lake in southwestern New South Wales, one of a series of ancient lake beds that make up the Willandra Lakes region. Today, it is a sparse, flat, semi-arid landscape, low shrubs, red earth, the occasional stand of acacia. The sky out there is enormous, the way the sky gets in places where nothing is tall enough to interrupt it. 40,000 years ago, it was a lake. Fresh water, fed by streams from the mountains to the east, ringed with vegetation, teeming with fish and waterfowl and the megafauna that was still alive across the Australian continent at that time. Diprotodon, a wombat the size of a rhinoceros. Procoptodon, a giant short-faced kangaroo twice the height of any living kangaroo. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, a predator that filled the ecological role of the big cats but evolved independently in total isolation from every other large predator on Earth. People lived around Lake Mungo. They cooked their food and made their tools and buried their dead on the shores of that lake. And when the lake eventually dried up, the sediments preserved what they left behind. The most famous finds from Lake Mungo are two sets of human remains known as Mungo Woman and Mungo Man. Mungo Woman, or Mungo Lady as she is sometimes called, was found in 1969 by a geologist, walking the exposed sediment faces of the ancient lake bed. The remains were fragmentary, partially burned, and had been deliberately interred. When they were dated, the result was approximately 42,000 years old. This made Mungo Woman the oldest cremation in the world. Not just the oldest in Australia, the oldest anywhere on Earth. Evidence of intentional funerary burning more than 40,000 years before the oldest written record. Mungo Man, found a few years later, was even older, with dates eventually settling somewhere between 40,000 and 65,000 years ago depending on the dating method used, a range of dates that has itself generated considerable debate. He had been buried with deliberate care, his body dusted with red ochre, the mineral pigment that shows up again and again in early human burials around the world, from Neanderthal sites in Europe to ancient burials in Africa to the earliest modern human graves known anywhere. Red ochre in a burial is not just a decoration. Or rather, it is a decoration, but it is decoration in the service of something. It is evidence of symbolic thinking, of ritual behavior, of the capacity to invest an object or a substance with meaning beyond its physical properties, of the understanding that death is an event that calls for a response beyond the purely practical. 40,000 years ago, people at Lake Mungo were responding to death with ceremony, with pigment, with careful placement of the body, with what we can only interpret from the evidence available as some form of intention about what death meant and what the dead deserved. And then there is the ochre itself. Because red ochre does not occur naturally in the Lake Mungo sediments, it is not local. It had to be carried there from somewhere else, from a source that has been estimated to be as far as 100 kilometers away. Someone, 40,000 years ago in Australia, walked 100 kilometers to bring red pigment back to bury their dead with. The effort involved implies not just ceremony but planning, not just emotion but organization, not just the impulse toward ritual, but the social infrastructure to support it. People who could plan ahead far enough to acquire materials specifically for use in a ceremony at a specific time. People who had categories for the dead that were distinct from categories for the living. People who thought, in some organized way, about what happened after death. This is not what we tend to imagine when we picture human societies 40,000 years ago, but it is what the Lake Mungo evidence shows. There is a third layer to the Mungo story that is less discussed but perhaps the most scientifically significant. When Mungo Man's ancient mitochondrial DNA was first extracted and analyzed in 2001, the result was startling. The mitochondrial lineage recovered from those 40,000-year-old bones did not match any known human lineage. Not any Aboriginal Australian lineage. Not any known Asian lineage. Not anything in the human mitochondrial database. The paper that published this result caused immediate controversy. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child without recombination, which makes it a clean marker for tracing maternal lineages back through time. The human mitochondrial tree has been mapped with considerable completeness, and all living humans fit somewhere on that tree. Mungo Man did not fit anywhere on the tree. The researchers who published the finding suggested it might represent an ancient human lineage that had contributed to the founding population of Australia, but subsequently went extinct, or been so diluted by later populations that it was no longer detectable in modern Aboriginal Australian genomes. Subsequent analyses have questioned the original results, raising the possibility of DNA contamination or degradation that produced a misleading sequence. The scientific debate around the Mungo Man mitochondrial DNA has been ongoing for more than 2 decades, and there is still no clean resolution. But even the controversy is informative. Because whether the original result was contamination or a genuine ancient lineage, what it tells us is that the early population history of Australia was complex enough to produce genetic results that do not fit our existing models. That the people who were here 50, 60, 65,000 years ago may not map cleanly onto the genetic categories we use to think about human prehistory. There is a cave in South Australia called Coonalda Cave that archaeologists found in 1956. It goes deep, deeper than most people expect a cave to go in that part of the country, and at the bottom, in the absolute darkness, on walls that no natural light has ever touched, there are marks, finger flutings, lines traced in the soft limestone by human fingers, in patterns that repeat, that suggest intention, that cover sections of the wall in organized designs. The dating on these marks has been difficult, but estimates put the oldest of them at between 20,000 and 30,000 years ago. 20 to 30,000 years ago, people crawled into a cave in complete darkness, hundreds of meters from the entrance, carrying whatever light sources they had, and made marks on the walls. They were not decorating the cave for viewers. No one was meant to see these marks. You cannot see them without going deep into the cave, which requires significant effort and not a small amount of discomfort. These were not public art. They were something else. Something done in darkness, in the deepest accessible space, away from the ordinary world. This pattern appears repeatedly in the deep human past on every continent where people lived during the Pleistocene. The impulse to go into the darkness and make marks. The caves in France and Spain with their famous paintings. The deep cave art of Indonesia, now dated to more than 45,000 years ago, which makes it the oldest figurative art in the world. The finger flutings of Coonalda. Something about the darkness of caves called to our ancestors. Something about the depth, the removal from the everyday world, the particular quality of silence and enclosure that only the deep underground provides, pulled them to bring their fire in and leave marks on the walls. We interpret these as ritual spaces, as places where the boundary between the ordinary world and some other dimension of experience was felt to be thinner. And in many Aboriginal Australian ceremonial traditions, that is exactly what caves are. Places where the ancestral world, the dreaming, the dimension of time and creation in which the world was made and is still being remade, is more accessible than it is in the ordinary daylight world above. The dreaming is perhaps the most misunderstood concept in Aboriginal Australian spiritual and cosmological tradition, and it deserves a careful explanation here because it is central to understanding how a culture maintains itself over 65,000 years without writing. The dreaming, or the dream time as it is sometimes called in English translations, is not primarily about dreams in the sleeping sense. It is not a past tense. And it is not mythology in the way that word implies a body of stories that people believe symbolically but do not regard as literally real. The dreaming is a concept of time that operates differently from the linear time of Western thinking. In the Western conception, time is a line, past is behind us, future is ahead, present is the moving point where we stand. What happened in the past is finished. It is over. It influences the present only through its effects, but the events themselves are done. In the dreaming, the events of creation are not finished. They are still happening. The ancestral beings who shaped the landscape, who called the mountains and rivers and species into being through their actions as they traveled across the country, are not historical figures in the sense of figures who existed once and are now gone. They are ongoing presences. Their journeys are still occurring. Their creative acts are still reverberating through the landscape. This is not metaphor, or at least, it is not only metaphor. It is also a claim about the nature of time and reality that is genuinely different from the Western linear model. And one of its practical effects, in terms of cultural maintenance over very long periods of time, is that it creates an obligation to the present rather than just to the past. The ceremonies are not commemorations of something that happened. They are participations in something that is happening. The songs are not history lessons. They are acts of maintenance. They keep the world in good order by aligning human action with the ongoing creative process of the dreaming. This gives the culture a structural reason to maintain its knowledge with extraordinary fidelity across generations. You are not preserving historical information about what ancestors did. You are maintaining a living connection with ancestors who are still active. Getting it wrong is not a historical error. It is a cosmological failure with real consequences in the present. This is one reason, anthropologists have suggested, why Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have managed to preserve accurate information across such extraordinary timescales. The cultural stakes of error are not academic, they are existential. Now we need to move into the territory that really does not fit the standard narrative, the territory that makes mainstream archaeologists cautious and makes everyone else ask questions that the field has not fully answered. There is a body of evidence suggesting that Aboriginal Australians were not simply passive recipients of a continent, that they actively managed it. That over 50,000+ years, they developed and implemented sophisticated land management systems that operated at a continental scale and shaped the Australian landscape in ways that are still visible today. The most direct evidence for this is fire. Aboriginal Australians used fire. This is not a controversial statement. Every group of humans that has ever existed has used fire. But Aboriginal Australians used fire in a way that was systematically different from the incidental or opportunistic fire use of most other cultures. They used it as a land management tool, applied in a pattern across the landscape to achieve specific ecological outcomes. The practice is sometimes called cultural burning or fire stick farming, and it has been documented extensively in historical accounts from the colonial period, when Europeans observed Aboriginal people setting fires in patterns that made no obvious sense to observers from a tradition where fire was primarily something to be controlled rather than something to be deployed. What the Europeans were watching, though they did not understand it at the time, was the application of an extremely sophisticated ecological management system developed over tens of thousands of years of intimate knowledge of Australian ecosystems. The basic principle is this. Different plant communities respond differently to fire. Some species need fire to germinate. Some are suppressed by it. The frequency, intensity, season, and spatial pattern of burning determines which species thrive and which ones recede. A landscape managed with carefully timed, spatially patterned burning will have a very different mix of plant species than a landscape that is not burned, or a landscape burned randomly. And a specific mix of plant species attracts specific animals. It creates feeding habitat for preferred game species. It maintains open pathways between water sources and shelter. It reduces the fuel load that allows catastrophic, uncontrolled fires to develop. It keeps the landscape productive and navigable in ways that purely natural fire regimes, which tend toward either long dry periods with accumulating fuel followed by massive conflagrations, do not. Aboriginal Australians were doing this for tens of thousands of years. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but across vast areas of the continent, in patterns calibrated to local conditions and managed by custodians of specific country whose knowledge of that country accumulated across generations. The ecological signature of this management is visible in the pollen record. Sediment cores from ancient lake beds across Australia show shifts in the plant communities that correspond to the arrival of humans and to the intensification of human presence. Species that thrive in fire-managed landscapes become more common. Species that are suppressed by frequent burning become less common. The landscape changes in ways that reflect, over thousands of years, the cumulative effect of deliberate, systematic intervention. This is not farming in the sense that the word usually implies. There are no cultivated fields, no irrigation systems, no domesticated crops. But it is something that shares the essential characteristic of farming, which is the deliberate modification of the environment to increase its productivity for human purposes. Bruce Pascoe, an Australian author of Aboriginal descent, argued in his 2014 book Dark Emu that the evidence for Aboriginal land management was significantly more extensive than the standard story of nomadic hunter-gatherers acknowledged. He documented historical accounts of permanent stonefish traps, grain harvesting and storage, aquaculture systems, and semi-permanent settlements that suggested a level of landscape transformation far beyond what the hunter-gatherer label implies. The book generated considerable debate. Some of his interpretations have been challenged. Some of the historical accounts he drew on have been questioned. The scholarly argument about the precise nature and scale of Aboriginal land management before European contact is ongoing. But the core observation that Aboriginal Australians were active managers of their landscape, rather than passive inhabitants of it, is supported by a substantial body of archaeological, paleoecological, and historical evidence that cannot be dismissed. What we are talking about is a land management tradition developed over 50,000 years of accumulated knowledge and refined through continuous experiment and observation. A tradition that shaped the Australian landscape on a continental scale. A tradition that, when it was disrupted by European colonization, produced some of the ecological consequences we see playing out in Australian environments today. Invasive species explosions, fuel load accumulation leading to catastrophic wildfires, degradation of water quality in river systems, collapse of species that were maintained by the burning regimes they had evolved alongside. The catastrophic Australian bushfires that have become a recurring crisis in recent decades are not simply the product of climate change, though climate change makes them worse. They are also the product of 150 years of suppressing the cultural burning that had managed the fuel loads for 50,000 years before that. This is one of the practical implications of finally taking the length and sophistication of Aboriginal Australian civilization seriously. It is not just history, it is ecology, it is landscape management. It is information that is directly relevant to the future of the Australian continent. But let us follow another thread now, because one of the most startling things about the Aboriginal Australian story is not just how old it is, and not just how sophisticated it is, but how connected it might be to the broader human story in ways that the conventional narrative completely ignores. Let us talk about haplogroups. A haplogroup is a genetic classification. It describes a population that shares a common ancestor defined by a specific set of genetic mutations. Your mitochondrial haplogroup tells you about your maternal lineage, your ancestry through your mother's mother's mother going back through time. Your Y chromosome haplogroup tells you about your paternal lineage. If you carry a Y chromosome, your father's father's father going back through time. Haplogroups are the tools geneticists use to trace ancient migrations. If you find the same haplogroup in populations on opposite sides of the world, it tells you those populations share a common ancestor who carried that haplogroup, and it gives you a basis for estimating when and how they were connected. Aboriginal Australians carry haplogroups that are among the oldest in the human genetic tree. Their mitochondrial lineages branch off the human family tree at points so deep and so early that they serve as reference points for understanding the structure of that tree. They are, in the genetic sense, living archives of the deepest human past. But here is where things get genuinely puzzling. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, before modern genetics existed, physical anthropologists studying skeletal remains and physical characteristics noted certain resemblances between Aboriginal Australians and populations in other parts of the world, particularly in South America, particularly among certain groups in the Amazon basin. At the time, these observations were either dismissed as coincidence or were co-opted into deeply problematic racial hierarchies that had nothing to do with actual human population history. The legitimate scientific question embedded in the observation, whether there was any real biological connection between populations on opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean, was obscured by the context in which the observation was made. Modern genetics has returned to that question and produced results that are remarkable. In 2015, a genetic study published in Nature found evidence of a connection between Aboriginal Australians and certain Amazonian populations in Brazil. The researchers found that populations in the Amazon carried a genetic signal that was most closely related to Aboriginal Australians and other Australasian populations, a signal that was not shared with other Native American populations. The researchers called the ancestral population responsible for this signal Population Y, after Yipiquera, meaning ancestor in the Tupi language. and they noted that it seemed to represent a migration that had somehow contributed to the peopling of South America independently of the main Native American founding population. The main founding population of the Americas is well established. People crossed from Siberia into North America via the Bering Land Bridge, then spread south through the continent. Their genetic signature is clear and well characterized. All Native American populations, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, show this ancestry. But the Amazonian populations with the population Y signal show something additional, something extra. A genetic component that connects them not to East Asia, where the main Native American founders came from, but to Australasia. How did an Australasian genetic component end up in the Amazon basin? This is a question that the 2015 paper raised without being able to answer. The researchers proposed several possibilities, none of which they could definitively confirm with the evidence available. One possibility is an early migration from Southeast Asia or Australasia across the Pacific to South America, arriving before or alongside the Siberian route migration. A population that was related to the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians or descended from populations that had passed through the same Southeast Asian region, somehow crossing the Pacific and contributing to the founding population of South America. The distances involved are staggering. The Pacific Ocean is the largest body of water on Earth. Crossing it, even following island chains, requires extraordinary navigational capability. But we know from the evidence of Polynesian navigation that the Pacific has been crossed multiple times by non-European peoples using traditional navigation methods of great sophistication. The Polynesians reached Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand in deliberately planned voyages across thousands of kilometers of open water, guided by stars and currents and the behavior of birds and fish. Could something similar have happened much earlier? Could a population related to the first Australians or descended from the populations that produced the first Australians have reached South America via a Pacific route tens of thousands of years ago? The evidence is not conclusive, but the genetic signal is real. Population Y is real. The Australasian genetic component in Amazonian populations is real. And it requires an explanation that connects the Aboriginal Australian story to the earliest peopling of the Americas in a way that the textbook version of human prehistory does not include. Before we go further with the trans-Pacific connections, there is something we need to establish more clearly about the nature of the Australian continent itself during the period we are discussing. The Australia that Aboriginal people arrived on 65,000 years ago was not the Australia that exists today. The last great ice age was at its maximum extent roughly 20,000 years ago, but the climate effects of that ice age were already being felt 65,000 years ago. Global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today because so much of the world's water was locked up in the massive ice sheets covering the northern latitudes. At various points during this period, sea levels were as much as 100 to 120 meters lower than they are now. What this means, geographically, is that the Australian continent was significantly larger. The continental shelf, now submerged under 100 meters of water, was dry land. The shallow waters between Australia and New Guinea were dry land. Tasmania, now an island separated from the mainland by Bass Strait, was connected to the mainland. New Guinea, now separated by the Torres Strait, was part of the same landmass. The combined Australia-New Guinea landmass that existed during these low sea level periods has a name. Geologists call it Sahul. Sahul was significantly larger than modern Australia. It extended northward toward Indonesia and the islands of Southeast Asia, where another landmass, called Sunderland, extended south from the Asian mainland. Between Sahul and Sunderland, there was a gap of open ocean that could not be entirely eliminated, even at maximum glaciation, because the tectonic history of the region means the sea floor in that area does not expose as a land bridge, even when sea levels drop by 100 meters. This means that the people who first arrived in Sahul 50 to 65,000 years ago had to cross open water to get there. There was no land bridge, no way to walk. You had to get in something that could cross the ocean and cross it. We have no direct evidence of what those vessels looked like. Organic materials from 65,000 years ago do not survive, but we know the crossing was made because the people were there. And the minimum open water crossing required, even at the lowest possible sea levels during the period, was somewhere between 60 and 90 kilometers. 60 to 90 kilometers of open ocean, in the dark, most likely, following star patterns and wind patterns and the clues embedded in ocean swells that skilled open water navigators learn to read. In vessels we know nothing about, built from materials that have not survived. The first people to reach Australia were not timid coastal waders. They were accomplished blue water navigators making deliberate crossings of open ocean at a time when, as far as we can tell, this had never been done before by any human population. They were, in a meaningful sense, the first sailors in human history. This matters because it is another data point against the picture of early Australians as simply primitive peoples who happened to wander somewhere. Getting to Australia required planning. It required the construction of seaworthy vessels. It required navigational knowledge. It required either a community effort or at minimum a community capable of sustaining individuals with the specialized skills the crossing demanded. You do not accidentally end up in Australia. You go there because you know how to go there. And then the picture gets more complex still, because the archaeological evidence from Sahul in the period after the initial settlement does not show a simple gradual spread from a single landing point. It shows something more like rapid colonization. Sites appear across the continent within what, in geological terms, is a very short time. The implication is either that the initial settlement was already a substantial group capable of spreading quickly, or that there were multiple arrivals over a period of time, or both. There is also the megafauna question, which has been one of the most contentious debates in Australian prehistory for decades. When humans arrived in Sahul, the continent was home to a remarkable fauna of giant animals. Diprotodon, the giant wombat mentioned earlier, but also giant kangaroos of multiple species, a large flightless bird called Genionis, a giant echidna, a giant goanna lizard called Megalania that was the largest terrestrial lizard ever to exist, reaching lengths of up to 7 meters, and various other oversized versions of animals whose descendants are still alive today in smaller forms. All of these animals went extinct during the period of early human occupation. The timing of their extinction correlates with human arrival. The debate in the field has been whether humans caused those extinctions through hunting, whether climate change at the end of the Ice Age caused them, or whether some combination of the two was responsible. The emerging consensus, built on increasingly precise dating of both fossil remains and archaeological sites, is that human arrival played a significant role. The Australian megafauna, which had never encountered human hunters before, may have been naive enough to allow itself to be hunted at rates its reproduction could not sustain. Large animals reproduce slowly. If humans were killing them faster than they could reproduce, even relatively low hunting pressure could drive populations to extinction over centuries. What this means is that the earliest Aboriginal Australians were living in a continent full of enormous animals that no longer exist. Their landscape was dramatically different from the Australia of historical times, and their ecological knowledge and cultural traditions were shaped by interactions with species that are now gone forever. The dreaming stories of many Aboriginal communities contain accounts of creatures that do not match any living Australian species. Animals that sound, when described, like they might be memories of the megafauna, giant beings that move through the landscape in the ancestral time. There is a creature in some oral traditions called the bunyip, described in various ways across different communities but consistently characterized as large, water-associated, and dangerous. Some researchers have speculated that the bunyip tradition might be a cultural memory of the Diprotodon, which was semi-aquatic and enormous. The dates would require the memory to have been preserved for at least 40,000 years. Which is, we now know, entirely within the range of what Aboriginal oral traditions have demonstrated they are capable of preserving. We need to stop and consider something carefully here, because what is being assembled in this story is not a fringe theory. It is not speculation from people who want to rewrite history to fit some ideological agenda. The evidence being discussed comes from peer-reviewed genetics journals, from archaeological papers published in the best journals in the field, from geological studies cross-referencing oral traditions, from physical anthropology and linguists and ecologists. What is unusual is not the evidence. What is unusual is that the evidence has not been assembled into a coherent picture that gets taught alongside the civilizations that do get taught. Aboriginal Australian civilization is treated as a cultural curiosity rather than as one of the great chapters of the human story. Its 65,000-year span, its genetic depth, its astronomical traditions, its land management systems, its oral traditions that preserve accurate geological information across 7,000-year spans, none of this is secret. The papers are there, the data is there, but it does not fit comfortably into the story of human progress that Western civilization tells about itself, so it tends to get treated as an aside rather than as a central chapter. The story of human progress, as usually told, goes something like this. Primitive hunter-gatherers everywhere, then agriculture, then settled civilization, then writing, then all the things that follow. The further you can trace your civilization back into that progression, the more central you are to the human story. The civilizations with the earliest written records, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, India, Greece, these are the foundational chapters. Everything else is peripheral. Aboriginal Australian civilization does not fit this model because it does not go through the same stages in the same order. It has 65,000 years of continuous presence and cultural sophistication that does not produce cities or writing or the other markers that the standard model uses to measure civilizational achievement. And so it tends to get classified as something other than civilization, as prehistory, as culture, as indigenous knowledge, categories that are real, but that carry an implicit hierarchy. But what if the hierarchy is wrong? What if the ability to maintain a culture for 65,000 years in continuous, living, adaptive form is itself a form of achievement that is more demanding and more impressive than building monuments? What if the songlines are a more sophisticated information storage system than writing in certain respects? Not in all respects, but in the specific respect of resilience across time. Writing requires infrastructure, libraries, scribes, institutions to maintain those libraries. History is full of civilizations whose written records were destroyed when their institutions collapsed. The Library of Alexandria, the libraries of the Maya, burned by the Spanish. The records of countless cultures that put their knowledge on fragile media and then suffered the disasters that destroyed those media. The Aboriginal Australian information storage system survived through 65,000 years of ice ages and mega droughts and sea level changes and everything else, because it was distributed across a continent in living human minds and maintained through social and ceremonial structures that self-repaired across generations. You cannot burn a songline. You cannot loot an oral tradition. You cannot destroy a cultural memory by destroying a building. This is a resilience property that written civilization has consistently failed to achieve and continues to fail to achieve today. We are not better at preserving knowledge than Aboriginal Australians were. We are better at generating it quickly and at transmitting it across physical distances. But across time? Across the long, brutal, eroding time that tests everything? The 65,000-year record speaks for itself. Now let us go even further into the territory where the evidence becomes less settled and the questions become larger. There is a researcher named Gavin Menzies who wrote a provocative and deeply controversial book claiming that Chinese naval fleets circumnavigated the globe in the early 15th century and visited Australia before European contact. The book, published in 2002, was widely dismissed by historians and geographers, and most of the specific claims in it have not held up to scrutiny. But the underlying question, whether there was contact between Australia and the civilizations of Asia before European arrival, is not answered by dismissing Menzies. It is a real question that deserves real engagement, and the genetic evidence for the Indian population connection 4,000 to 5,000 years ago suggests that some form of contact did occur, even if we cannot yet characterize it fully. There are also traditions within some Aboriginal communities of contact with Macassan traders from what is now Indonesia, who visited the northern Australian coast for centuries before European arrival. The Macassans came for trepang, sea cucumbers, which they harvested from Australian coastal waters and traded to Chinese merchants. Their presence on the Australian coast is documented in Aboriginal art and oral traditions, and is also confirmed by historical records from the Macassan side. This Macassan contact is not controversial, it is established. What it establishes is that Aboriginal Australians were not isolated from the wider world in the period immediately before European contact. They had trading relationships with Asian maritime cultures. They incorporated aspects of those interactions into their own traditions. The question then becomes, how far back does that pattern of contact go? The Indian genetic signal at 4,000 to 5,000 years ago suggests it goes back well beyond the historically documented Macassan contact. How much further? That question has not been answered. Let us go back to the genetic story, because it keeps pulling us back, and it keeps refusing to resolve into a simple picture. The population Y finding, the Australasian signal in Amazonian populations, was published in 2015 and immediately raised a question the researchers could not answer. How did a genetic signal related to Aboriginal Australians end up in South America? The straightforward geographical answer is that it had to cross the Pacific. There is no other route. You cannot get from Australia or Southeast Asia to South America without crossing the Pacific Ocean or going back through the whole of Asia, across the Bering Land Bridge, and down through North America. The latter route, through North America, would produce a different genetic signature in North American populations along the way. That signature is not present. The population Y signal appears in South America without leaving a trail through North America. So the Pacific crossing hypothesis is essentially forced by the geography and the genetics. If population Y is real, it came from the west, which means it came across the Pacific. Now, crossing the Pacific is not impossible. We know it was done repeatedly by Polynesian navigators in the historical period. And we know, from the presence of the sweet potato in Polynesia, that contact between Polynesia and South America occurred in the pre-European period, because the sweet potato is a South American plant that somehow made it to Polynesia before European ships could have carried it. But the Polynesian expansion is itself relatively recent. Polynesian people began settling the remote Pacific islands roughly 3,000 years ago, reaching Hawaii and New Zealand within the last 1,500 years or so. If the population Y signal in South America dates to a time before the Polynesian expansion, then whoever carried it could not have been Polynesian. The dating of the population Y contribution to South American genomes is uncertain. Population genetic methods can estimate when different ancestry components arrived in a genome, but those estimates carry significant uncertainty ranges. The best estimates from the 2015 study suggested the population Y contribution entered South American populations before the main Native American founding population, which would put it at a very great time depth indeed. This remains one of the most puzzling findings in the recent human genetics literature, and it has not been resolved. But it sits alongside another line of evidence that has also been generating quiet unease in the academic community for some time. The cranial morphology of some of the oldest human skeletal remains found in the Americas. Cranial morphology is the study of skull shape. Different human populations have different characteristic skull shapes, and these shapes can be quantified and compared. It is a field with a troubled history, because in the 19th and early 20th centuries it was used to construct racial hierarchies that were entirely invalid. The legitimate scientific uses of cranial morphology have had to work hard to distance themselves from that history. But when those legitimate methods are applied to the oldest human skulls found in the Americas, some of those skulls do not look like the modern Native American skulls that would be expected if the founding population all came from Northeast Asia via the Bering Land Bridge. The most famous example is a skull found in coastal Brazil, from a site called Lagoa Santa, dating to roughly 10,000 years ago. The skull is different. It is more robust in some ways, different in the proportions of the face and cranium, different in ways that have led some physical anthropologists to note resemblances to Aboriginal Australian skulls, rather than to modern East Asian or Native American skulls. This is extraordinarily controversial, The implications are so far from the conventional model that many researchers have resisted taking them seriously. The cranial morphology differences could have other explanations. They could reflect plasticity within a population. They could be artifacts of the preservation or reconstruction of the fossil. They could be coincidence. But the Lagoa Santa findings have not gone away, and they have not been definitively explained within the conventional model. And when you put them alongside the population-wide genetic signal, when you see two independent lines of evidence, one genetic and one morphological, both suggesting some form of connection between the oldest South American populations and Australasian populations, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as coincidence. What are we looking at here? A migration of Australasian-related people across the Pacific to South America tens of thousands of years ago. The preservation in South America of a very early human lineage that was also present in Australasia before being replaced or diluted elsewhere? Something else entirely? The honest answer is that we do not know. The evidence is real. The explanations are genuinely uncertain. And the uncertainty is significant enough that the people working in this field are still actively arguing about it. But the fact that it is being argued about, that it is generating papers in Nature and Science and major genetics journals, tells you that whatever is happening here is not the product of fringe speculation. It is a genuine scientific puzzle at the frontier of what we understand about human prehistory. Now, let us go to the language, because the language preserves things that the bones and the genes do not. Australian Aboriginal languages are, collectively, among the most diverse and most ancient language systems on Earth. There are, or were before European colonization dramatically reduced their number, somewhere between 300 and 500 distinct Aboriginal languages, belonging to multiple language families with no established connections to languages spoken anywhere else in the world. The Pamanyungan language family covers most of the continent and is itself one of the largest language families in the world in terms of geographic coverage. But outside the Pamanyungan family, there are dozens of non-Pamanyungan languages in the north of the continent that are so different from each other and from Pamanyungan that linguists classify them as separate language families entirely. This degree of linguistic diversity is what you expect to find in a region where people have been present for a very long time. The longer a population stays in a place, the more their languages diverge from each other. The linguistic diversity of Aboriginal Australia is consistent with, and to some extent, independent evidence for, the deep time of human presence on the continent. But there is something specific in the language record that deserves attention here. Something that connects to the broader questions about what Aboriginal culture has preserved. There are words in some Australian languages for species that are no longer alive, animals that went extinct. This would be unremarkable if the extinctions were recent. But some of the species in question are megafauna that the current scientific consensus says went extinct between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago. The languages have been carrying the names of those animals across tens of thousands of years, in the same way they carry the locations of waterholes and the patterns of songlines and the accounts of ancient coastlines. The Yarralin people of the Northern Territory have traditional stories about a large creature they call the Yamuti. The description, gathered from elders, involves a very large animal with a pouch for its young, larger than a kangaroo. Some researchers working in this area have suggested the Yamuti tradition might preserve a memory of the Diprotodon, the giant wombat that went extinct somewhere between 40 and 45,000 years ago. This would require the memory to have been transmitted faithfully for 40,000 years. Given what we know about the transmission of the coastal flooding accounts across 7 to 12,000 years, the idea is not inherently implausible. But it remains speculative, because the connection between the oral tradition and the specific extinct species cannot be confirmed. What can be confirmed is the existence of the tradition. The words for large extinct animals are in the languages. The stories are there. What they refer to, and how long they have been there, is the open question. There is a broader pattern in Australian linguistic research that is worth noting, which is the identification of what linguists call deep regional dialects. Groups of languages across the continent that share structural features suggesting a common origin so ancient that most of the vocabulary has diverged completely, but the grammatical skeleton still shows the bones of shared ancestry. Tracing those deep relationships in Australian languages would, if possible, allow linguists to map the movement of populations across the continent in the earliest periods of human presence. It would provide a second independent line of evidence about who went where and when, complementing the genetic and archaeological records. The work is difficult because the time depths involved push up against the limits of linguistic reconstruction. Beyond about 8 to 10,000 years, the methods for reconstructing ancestral language states become increasingly uncertain. The time depth of Aboriginal Australian language diversity may be beyond what historical linguistics can reliably reach. But the attempt continues. Because if the linguistic record can be read at those time depths, what it would tell us about 65,000 years of human movement and cultural development across a continent is something no other language record in the world could provide. There is a mountain in western New South Wales called Broken Hill, and underneath that mountain is one of the richest ore deposits ever found. The silver, lead, and zinc buried there have been mined continuously since 1883, and the mining operation at Broken Hill is one of the things that built modern Australia's economy. But before the miners arrived, the Aboriginal people of that region knew the mountain. They had a name for it, and their knowledge of it was encoded in their songlines. And among the things preserved in those songlines was knowledge of the mineral properties of the ore bodies beneath the surface. This is not as remarkable as it might sound. Aboriginal Australians had a sophisticated empirical knowledge of geology. They quarried stone for tools, which required knowing where particular rock types occurred. They knew the properties of different clays for different uses. They used mineral pigments for ceremony and art, which required knowing where those minerals occurred and how to process them. But it extends beyond the purely practical. The connections between particular places and particular rock types, between the geological properties of country and the ceremonial significance of that country, run through Aboriginal Australian land knowledge in ways that modern geologists have sometimes found surprisingly informative. There are documented cases from the early Australian mining industry of prospectors using Aboriginal knowledge of country to guide their search for ore bodies. Not in every case, and not systematically, because the colonial relationship made such acknowledgement uncomfortable, but it happened. The knowledge was there. The observation that certain kinds of country had certain kinds of rocks beneath them, had been accumulated over 50,000 years of detailed attention to the land. Consider what that means. 50,000 years of people paying close attention to their country, noticing what kinds of plants grew in what kinds of soil, noticing the relationship between surface geology and the resources available in that country, encoding those observations in songlines and oral tradition, and passing them forward to each successive generation. The accumulated geological knowledge in Aboriginal oral traditions, even partially recovered, represents a dataset about Australian geology that took 50,000 years to compile. Modern geological surveys of Australia have been conducted over roughly 200 years. The Aboriginal geological knowledge system was being updated for 250 times as long. This is not to suggest that Aboriginal oral traditions contain the equivalent of modern geological surveys. They do not. And to claim that they do would be to distort the nature of what that knowledge is. But it is to suggest that the relationship between people and land developed over 50,000 years of intimate cohabitation produces a kind of knowledge that has real content and real value, and that cannot be recovered from any other source now that the cultures that held it have been so severely disrupted. Let us pivot now to something that almost never gets discussed in the context of Aboriginal Australian history, and that is the role that continent played in the development of what we might tentatively call proto-civilization. The development of social structures, ceremonial systems, and knowledge management practices that, if they had developed in a different ecological context, might have eventually produced writing and cities and the other markers that we use to identify civilization. The reason this is worth discussing is that it challenges a narrative that is deeply embedded in how Western civilization understands itself and its place in the human story. The narrative goes like this. Agriculture led to permanent settlements. Permanent settlements led to population growth. Population growth led to specialization of labor. Specialization of labor led to riding in cities and all the rest. And the societies that went through this process first are the foundational societies of human civilization. Australia does not fit this model. The evidence of Aboriginal Australian social complexity, ceremonial sophistication, astronomical knowledge, and land management capability suggests that the model is not complete, that it is possible to develop extraordinary levels of social and cognitive complexity without going through the agriculture-to-city pipeline. This is not a new observation. Anthropologists have been making it in various forms for decades, but the full implications of it, particularly in light of the 65,000-year timeframe, are still being worked through. Because here is the question that arises when you take the Aboriginal Australian case seriously. If it is possible to maintain sophisticated civilization-equivalent social structures and knowledge systems for 65,000 years without writing or cities, what does that tell us about the development of those things in the societies that did develop them? Maybe writing and cities are not the inevitable destination of human social evolution. Maybe they are one path among several, the path that happens to have produced the most rapid technological change over the last 5,000 years, but not necessarily the only path that qualifies as a form of human achievement worth taking seriously. The question of what happened to Aboriginal Australians after European contact in 1788 is not our primary subject here, but it cannot be entirely avoided, because it is the context within which all of the knowledge and tradition we have been discussing was nearly destroyed. When the first fleet arrived at Botany Bay in January of 1788, they were not arriving in an empty land. They were arriving in a land that had been occupied and managed and known for 65,000 years. The continent they landed on was not a wilderness. It was a cultural landscape, shaped by human hands and human knowledge across a span of time that made the entire history of European civilization look like a brief episode. What followed was one of the most comprehensive cultural destructions in human history. Not a quick conquest, but a slow grinding erasure that unfolded over more than a century and that combined deliberate policy with disease, dispossession, and the disruption of every social structure that had maintained Aboriginal knowledge across the generations. The impact on the knowledge systems we have been discussing was catastrophic. Languages went extinct. Elders who carried knowledge in their memories died without being able to transmit it fully. The ceremonial structures that maintained the songlines were disrupted. The country-specific knowledge that was tied to specific custodians became orphaned as those custodians were moved off their country or died without successors. This is not ancient history. It is recent enough that some of the people who lived through it, or whose parents lived through it, are still alive. The stolen generations, the policy of removing Aboriginal children from their families and placing them in institutions where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their traditions, was officially government policy in Australia until the 1970s. The 1970s, 50 years ago. Everything we have been discussing, the 65,000-year bloodline, the deep genetics, the astronomical traditions, the preserved geological accounts, the land management knowledge, all of it survived 65,000 years of ice ages and mega droughts and sea level changes, and then came within living memory of being permanently destroyed by deliberate human policy. Some of it has been destroyed. Languages that were spoken 500 years ago are now extinct, and the knowledge encoded in them is gone. Ceremonial traditions that were maintained continuously for tens of thousands of years have been broken and cannot be fully restored. Songlines that covered specific country have been severed by the displacement of their custodians. The recovery project that has been underway since the late 20th century, the efforts by Aboriginal communities to reclaim and restore and document what survives, is one of the most important ongoing human projects on Earth. Not because it is politically correct to say so, but because the knowledge that survives in living Aboriginal culture and in the documentary records made before the worst of the destruction is literally irreplaceable. There is no other 65,000-year human record. There is no other data set about what our species has experienced across that time span in continuous living form. The astronomical observations, the geological memory, the ecological knowledge, the deep genetics, All of it exists only because there were Aboriginal people who held it across all of those generations, and because some of them have survived and continue to hold it today. Now let us return to the genetic story, because there is one more piece that we have not yet addressed, and it may be the most significant finding of all, in terms of what it tells us about the position of Aboriginal Australians in the human story. The genetic bottleneck we mentioned earlier, the narrowing that happened when the founding population left Africa and eventually gave rise to all non-African people, left a measurable signature in the genomes of every non-African population on Earth. A reduction in genetic diversity relative to African populations who never went through that filter. Aboriginal Australians went through that bottleneck. Their lineage diverged from African populations before the bottleneck, and then went through its own founder effects on the route to Australia. Their genetic diversity has been shaped by all of that. But what the genetic analysis consistently shows is that Aboriginal Australians retain, within that framework, an extraordinary depth of genetic variation. The diversity within Aboriginal Australian populations, when measured correctly, reflects the depth of their time on the continent. The accumulation of variation over 65,000 years of continuous presence, with relatively little influx from outside populations diluting or homogenizing that variation. This means that Aboriginal Australian genomes contain information about early human genetic history that is available nowhere else. They are, in a very real sense, the living archive of the deepest human past outside Africa. When geneticists want to understand what the founding population of all non-African people looked like, Aboriginal Australian genomes are among the most important reference points available. They are not just old, they are informationally dense. They carry more signal from the deep human past than almost any other population on Earth. Let us go somewhere deeper now. Let us go into the territory where the Australian story intersects with things that mainstream archaeology acknowledges but does not quite know what to do with. In the Northern Territory of Australia, there is a rock art tradition that stretches back further than almost any comparable tradition anywhere in the world. The art is found on sandstone outcrops and cliff faces, and in rock shelters across a region called Arnhem Land and in the broader top end. It has been made continuously, layer upon layer, for tens of thousands of years. The oldest layers of rock art in Arnhem Land are estimated to be between 28,000 and 50,000 years old. The dating of these earliest layers is difficult for the same reasons. All very early organic material is difficult to date, but the stratigraphic evidence, the relationship between the art and the sediment layers that cover and protect it, confirms that some of it is extraordinarily old. And within that oldest art, there are images that depict things that do not exist in Australia today. There are images of animals that appear to be thylacines, the Tasmanian tiger, a marsupial predator that survived in Tasmania until 1936, when the last captive individual died in a Hobart zoo. Thylacines were present on the Australian mainland until roughly 3,000 years ago, when they appear to have been outcompeted by the dingo. In Arnhem Land, thylacine images in the rock art confirm their presence there during the period when the art was being made. But there are also images that do not match any known Australian species, living or extinct. Images of large animals with unusual body proportions, with characteristics that do not fit neatly into any known category. Some researchers have suggested these might represent the megafauna, images of the giant animals made by the earliest residents of the continent before those animals went extinct. If even some of the depictions in the oldest rock art layers represent encounters with megafauna, then they are images made by people who lived alongside the Diprotodon and the giant kangaroos and megalania. They are eyewitness records, encoded in pigment on rock, of a world that no longer exists. There is something almost unbearable about that thought, that there are paintings in Australia that are genuine eyewitness records of animals that have been extinct for 40,000 years. That someone, 45,000 years ago, stood in front of a rock face in Arnhem Land and painted an image of a creature they had seen, and that image is still there, still carrying that information across the millennia. The rock art of Australia is, in total, one of the most extensive archaeological records on Earth. Millions of images, across every part of the continent where suitable rock surfaces exist, spanning tens of thousands of years of continuous production. What those images document is a changing record of Australian life across deep time. The animals that were present in different periods, the people who made the art and how they depicted themselves, the objects they used, the ceremonies they conducted, the spiritual beings they engaged with, all of it preserved in a medium that, unlike organic material, does not decay in the dry Australian climate. The Australian rock art record is the longest continuous visual record of human cultural life on Earth, and most of the world does not know it exists. The question that keeps recurring, the one that the evidence keeps forcing back to the surface, is this: why do we not know this better? Why is Aboriginal Australian civilization not a standard chapter in every world history curriculum? Why is the 65,000-year bloodline not as famous as the pyramids? Part of the answer is simple and uncomfortable. The systems of knowledge that determined what got counted as civilization were developed by European academics who had specific cultural assumptions about what civilization looked like. Those assumptions were not neutral. They were built around the achievements of cultures that resembled European civilization in certain key respects: cities, writing, monumental architecture, organized religion with formal theology, military hierarchies. Aboriginal Australian civilization had none of those things in the forms that European academics were looking for, so it was categorized as something other than civilization: primitive, pre-civilized. A stage that European cultures had moved through on their way to something higher. This categorization was wrong, empirically wrong, in ways that the evidence has made increasingly clear. But the categories persist, and they persist in part because acknowledging that they are wrong has uncomfortable implications for the story that Western civilization tells about itself and its place in human history. But there is another part of the answer, one that is less about ideology and more about simple knowledge production. The study of Aboriginal Australian prehistory requires specific conditions that took a long time to develop. It requires trust between researchers and Aboriginal communities. It requires legal and ethical frameworks for research on human remains and genetic material that were not in place for most of the 20th century. It requires collaboration between disciplines, genetics, archaeology, linguistics, ecology, oral history, that does not come naturally to academic systems organized around departmental boundaries. Those conditions have been coming together gradually over the last 30 to 40 years. The pace of discovery has accelerated enormously as a result. The 2011 genome paper, the 2015 population Y paper, the work on astronomical traditions, the cross-disciplinary research on oral histories and geological events. All of this work has been produced in a relatively short period of time. We are, in a meaningful sense, only at the beginning of what the Australian evidence can tell us about the human story. The techniques for extracting information from ancient DNA are improving rapidly. The scope and quality of oral tradition documentation is improving. The collaboration between Aboriginal communities and researchers is deepening. What comes out of that process over the next 20 years may fundamentally change how we understand not just Australian prehistory, but human prehistory as a whole. Because Australia is not just a local story. The Aboriginal Australian case is a case study in what human culture is capable of across deep time. It is a demonstration that the path to cognitive sophistication, to complex social organization, to sophisticated knowledge management, does not require the specific technologies that Western civilization happened to develop. It shows that human beings, given enough time and the right social conditions, can develop and maintain extraordinary intellectual and cultural achievements through pathways that Western categories of civilization are not equipped to recognize. And it raises a question that we have barely begun to ask. If the Aboriginal Australian case exists, if 65,000 years of unbroken cultural sophistication can exist without writing or cities, and go almost entirely unrecognized for 250 years of scholarly investigation, how many other cases like it might exist that we have also failed to recognize? Not on the same scale. Nothing else is on the same scale. but the principle that we may be systematically underestimating the cognitive and cultural achievements of pre-literate societies, because our evaluative framework is built around the specific achievements of literate ones, that principle has implications far beyond Australia. It means the human story is older, deeper, more complex, and more varied than the version we have been telling ourselves. It means the chapters we call prehistory, the chapters that cover 95% of the time humans have existed, are not a blank prelude to the real story. They are the real story, and we have barely started reading them. Now we are going to go to a specific and remarkable piece of evidence that brings together the genetic story, the archaeological story, and the question of transoceanic contact in a way that is both compelling and not fully resolved. In the 1980s, a physical anthropologist named Alan Thorne spent years studying a collection of ancient human skulls found at various sites across Australia. Thorne was one of the most prominent Australian paleoanthropologists of his generation, and his work was focused on understanding the physical diversity of ancient Australian populations. What Thorne found, and what he argued for the rest of his career, was that the ancient Australians were not a uniform population. The oldest skulls from sites like Cow Swamp in Victoria had a morphology that was robust, heavy-browed, and in certain features reminiscent of pre-modern human populations like Homo erectus. The skulls from Lake Mungo, by contrast, were more gracile, with features closer to the modern human average. Thorne interpreted this as evidence for what he called a multi-regional model of human evolution, in which the populations of different regions evolved continuously in place, rather than being replaced by a single out-of-Africa migration. This model has been largely rejected by mainstream paleoanthropology, which accepts the out-of-Africa replacement model as better supported by both genetic and fossil evidence. But the morphological diversity that Thorne identified in ancient Australian skulls is real, even if his interpretation of it was wrong. The question of why the oldest known Australians show such morphological diversity, and specifically why some of them show features that, to some physical anthropologists, suggest archaic characteristics, has not been cleanly resolved. One explanation, consistent with the genetics, is that the founding population of Australia was itself the product of complex ancestry, including contributions from archaic populations encountered on the route to Australia. The Denisovan ancestry, the ghost lineage signal. These genetic contributions came from somewhere, from populations that may have had physical characteristics different from fully modern humans as we define them. The physical diversity of ancient Australians might be, in part, the physical expression of that complex ancestry. The robustness seen in some skulls might reflect genetic contributions from archaic populations who were themselves more robust than modern humans. The gracile form at Lake Mungo might reflect the modern human ancestry more purely. This is speculative. The connection between specific genetic contributions and specific physical characteristics is complex and not always predictable. But it is a plausible framework for understanding a pattern that otherwise sits uncomfortably in the fossil record. And it connects to a broader point about the early population of Australia that deserves emphasis. The people who first arrived in Sahul were not, genetically, simply modern humans with an unmodified modern human genome. They were people who had already, by the time they arrived, accumulated genetic contributions from multiple archaic populations, from Neanderthals, encountered somewhere in the Middle East or South Asia, from Denisovans, encountered somewhere in Southeast Asia, from the ghost population, encountered somewhere unknown. They were, already, at the moment of their arrival in Australia, a significantly more genetically complex population than the simple model of modern human expansion suggests. And then they sat on that continent for 65,000 years, their genetic complexity persisting and diverging in isolation, accumulating its own Australian-specific variations. The genome you get when you sequence an Aboriginal Australian today contains layers of information from multiple episodes of human history: the African origin, the archaic admixture from multiple sources, the deep Australian isolation, the relatively recent Indian contribution, each layer telling part of a story that stretches from the very beginning of the modern human expansion to the present day. It is the most layered human genetic record outside of Africa, and we have barely begun to read it. Here is a question that brings several of the threads we have been following into a single focus. If the Aboriginal Australian case is as extraordinary as the evidence suggests, if this is one of the most significant chapters in the human story, then why does the mystery not receive more attention? Why is it not at the top of every list of the great unsolved puzzles of human prehistory? The simple answer is that mysteries become famous when they fit within a narrative that already has wide cultural currency. The mystery of the Egyptian pyramids is famous because Western culture has a framework for thinking about Egypt. Egypt is part of the origin story of Western civilization. It gets included in the curriculum, it gets the documentaries and the blockbuster films. Aboriginal Australian culture does not have that framework. It is not part of the origin story that Western civilization tells about itself, because that origin story is primarily located in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, and it moves forward in time toward us. Australia is at the other end of the world, literally, and the human story that happened there is moving in a different direction, not toward the Mediterranean and the pyramids and Athens and Rome, but simply continuing, deepening, accumulating in place across a span of time that those Mediterranean stories cannot encompass. But there is another element to why the mystery is under-discussed, and it connects to the specific nature of what makes it mysterious. The things that are mysterious about the Aboriginal Australian story are not the kind of mysteries that produce dramatic visual images. There is no hidden temple to find, no lost city under the jungle, no artifact that cannot be explained. The mystery is written in DNA, which you cannot see. It is encoded in oral traditions that require years of relationship to access. It is preserved in rock art that requires expertise to read and that you cannot point a camera at and have the strangeness immediately register. The mystery is deep. It is subtle. It requires context and knowledge to appreciate. It does not photograph well. And it is a mystery that, once you understand it, points outward in every direction. It connects to the peopling of the Americas. It connects to the deep history of human navigation. It connects to the question of what culture is capable of across deep time. It connects to the ecological history of a continent. It connects to the ongoing debate about what intelligence and civilization actually mean. This is the kind of mystery that, once you start pulling at the threads, keeps going. There is no single dramatic revelation that ends it. Instead, every answer generates more questions, and the questions get bigger and reach further until they are touching the foundations of how we understand the human story itself. The Aboriginal bloodline is the oldest human bloodline outside of Africa. The culture built around that bloodline is the oldest continuous culture on Earth. The knowledge systems embedded in that culture contain information that cannot be recovered from any other source. The genetic record encoded in the genomes of Aboriginal people carries information about deep human history that is available nowhere else. All of this is real. All of it is documented in peer-reviewed research. And it keeps expanding. The more researchers look, the more they find. The more carefully they listen to the oral traditions, the more they find encoded in them. The more they sequence, the more layers of history they uncover in the genomes. We are living in a period when the tools to finally read this record have just become available, when the relationships between researchers and Aboriginal communities have matured enough to allow the work to proceed, when the pace of discovery is faster than it has ever been. What we are finding is not just interesting, it is rewriting fundamental assumptions about human prehistory. The history of our species is older, more complex, more surprising, and far more varied than the version most of us were taught. And the oldest bloodline on Earth, the people who have been here the longest, who carry the deepest record in their genes and their traditions and their song lines, they knew this all along. They have been trying to tell us. We need to talk about teeth. It sounds strange, but teeth survive when almost everything else does not. Bone deteriorates, organic material decomposes, DNA degrades in anything but the most favorable preservation conditions. But teeth, with their dense enamel coating, are among the most durable biological materials in the archaeological record. They last for hundreds of thousands of years in conditions that would destroy almost any other trace of a living person. And teeth carry information. Not just morphological information about the size and shape of the jaw, but chemical information locked in the enamel that formed during childhood, information about diet and geography and stress and disease. Isotope ratios in tooth enamel reflect the water a person drank and the food they ate during the years their teeth were forming. Because different geographic regions have different isotope signatures in their water and soil, the chemistry of your teeth carries a faint but readable record of where you spent your childhood. This technique, isotope analysis of tooth enamel, has been used extensively in European archaeology to track the movement of individuals across the ancient landscape. It has revealed patterns of mobility and migration in ancient European populations that would not be detectable through any other method. In Australia, the technique is newer and less developed, partly because the research infrastructure for applying it to Australian samples has taken time to build, but the early results are striking. In several ancient Australian burial sites, isotope analysis has found individuals whose tooth chemistry does not match the local geological signature of the region where they were buried. People who grew up somewhere else and then traveled, sometimes very far, to a place where they eventually died and were buried. This is not surprising in principle. Human populations have always moved. What makes the Australian results interesting is the scale of movement suggested by some of the cases. Individuals buried in coastal regions whose tooth chemistry reflects inland geological signatures. Individuals buried in desert regions whose chemistry reflects coastal water sources. The distances implied by some of these cases are substantial, hundreds of kilometers, across landscape types that most people today would hesitate to cross without modern equipment. What this suggests is that ancient Australians were not sedentary populations confined to small territories. They were mobile. They ranged over large areas. They moved across the continent in patterns we are only beginning to trace. The songlines in this context are not just maps. They are the infrastructure that made that mobility possible. The network of songlines covering the continent is, in a real sense, a route network. A system of paths through the landscape, marked by ceremony and song, connecting water sources and food resources and sacred sites across distances that would be lethal to traverse without the knowledge the songlines encode. If you know the songlines, you can move through Australia's harshest landscapes with a degree of confidence that outsiders cannot match. You know where the water is. You know what the weather is likely to do. You know who controls the country you are passing through and what the protocols are for passage. The songlines are, among other things, a continental infrastructure system for human mobility, and they have been maintained and used for tens of thousands of years. The isotope data suggests that infrastructure was actively used, that people moved across this network, that the ancient Australian population was far more mobile and far more interconnected than the standard image of isolated regional groups implies. This mobility has implications for understanding how cultural information moved across the continent. If people were moving long distances, then ideas and technologies and ceremonial innovations were also moving. Not through the slow diffusion of neighboring groups gradually borrowing from each other, but through the direct movement of individuals who carried their knowledge with them. This is how you maintain cultural consistency across a continent. Not by everyone staying in one place and passing knowledge vertically down the generations, but by people moving across the landscape and carrying knowledge horizontally across communities as well. Both vectors of transmission, vertical and horizontal, working together to maintain a vast and complex cultural system in dynamic equilibrium. There is a site in Victoria called Budge Bim that most people outside Australia have never heard of. In 2019, the cultural landscape of Budge Bim was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List, becoming the first site inscribed entirely for its Aboriginal cultural values, rather than for any natural or colonial heritage significance. The reason for the inscription was a system of stone channels and weirs and holding ponds constructed by the Gunditj Mara people in the wetlands of what is now southwestern Victoria. The system was built to trap, hold and harvest eels, a highly nutritious and abundant food source in the volcanic landscape of the region. The Budge Bim aquaculture system is dated to at least 6,600 years ago. Let that register. An engineered aquaculture system built from stone, managing water flow to create and maintain a food production system 6,600 years ago in Australia. 6,600 years ago, the pyramids of Giza would not be built for another 1,500 years. The system at Bujbim is not a simple fish trap. It is an engineered landscape. Channels were cut into the volcanic rock, weirs were constructed to control water levels in different sections, holding ponds were created to keep live eels before harvest or to maintain breeding populations. The whole system manipulated the hydrology of the area over a significant spatial extent to optimize eel production. This required planning. It required engineering knowledge. It required an understanding of hydrology and of eel behavior, and of how to construct stone structures that would withstand the forces of seasonal flooding. It required a social structure capable of organizing the labor for the initial construction and then maintaining the system over subsequent generations. It also required permanence. You do not build a sophisticated aquaculture system in stone and then wander away from it. The Gunditj Mara people were not nomadic in the area around Bujbim. They were semi-sedentary. They maintained permanent or semi-permanent stone houses near the eel management system. They had a stable, reliable food supply that did not require constant movement. And they had this 6,600 years ago, well before agriculture was adopted anywhere in the world, at a comparably sophisticated level. The Bujbim system has been known to archaeologists since the 1970s, and its general character has been understood for decades. But it received very little public attention until the UNESCO inscription, and even now it is not widely known outside Australia. It should be one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. An aquaculture system 6,600 years old, built in stone, demonstrating that the Gunditj Mara people were developing sophisticated food production technology independently of any agricultural tradition and at a time depth that rivals the earliest agriculture in the Middle East. But it is not famous. It is not in the textbooks. It does not appear in the world history curricula that shape how most people understand human prehistory. The UNESCO inscription is a start, but the Bujbim system represents something much larger than its own site. It represents a pattern of sophisticated ecological management and food production technology in Australia that, because it did not take the form of grain agriculture, was systematically misidentified as the absence of technology rather than the presence of a different technology. The stonefish traps at Bujbim, the fire management systems across the continent, the careful tending of yam and seedgrass patches that some researchers have interpreted as proto-agricultural management, the aquaculture of freshwater resources in the river systems of the East. All of this adds up to a picture of a continent under sophisticated human management, developed over tens of thousands of years, using methods that European observers systematically failed to recognize as what they were. There is a concept in social science sometimes called invisible technology. Technology that is so well integrated into a culture that outsiders cannot see it as technology, because it does not look like what they expect technology to look like. Aboriginal Australian land management was invisible technology of this kind. It was there. It was sophisticated. It was producing the effects that were visible to European observers in the form of the seemingly miraculous productivity and biodiversity of the Australian landscape. But because it did not involve fields or fences or machinery or written instructions, it was not recognized as the deliberate, purposeful, technically sophisticated system it was. The stars, again. We need to go back to the stars, because there is a specific piece of astronomical knowledge preserved in Aboriginal Australian traditions that has only recently been fully appreciated, and it connects to questions that are much larger than astronomy. Across many Aboriginal Australian communities in different parts of the continent, there are oral traditions about specific stars and star clusters that describe behaviors, variations, and characteristics that were only confirmed by modern telescopic astronomy in the 19th and 20th centuries. The Pleiades, the star cluster, sometimes called the Seven Sisters in English, holds a special place in the astronomical traditions of cultures around the world. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, the Pleiades are also typically described as a group of women, and the stories about them share certain themes across communities separated by thousands of kilometers in ways that suggest either a very ancient common origin for the tradition or extensive cultural contact between geographically distant communities. But there is something specific about the Aboriginal Australian Pleiades tradition that goes beyond the usual level of astronomical awareness. In several communities, the traditions include accounts of the Pleiades losing a star, the cluster being described as having once had more members than it currently appears to have. Modern astronomy knows that the Pleiades is a young star cluster that has been shedding members over time as the gravitational binding of the cluster slowly loosens. The cluster has lost stars over the course of its astronomical history. The naked eye count of the cluster's stars has changed over time. How long would you need to observe the Pleiades to notice that it had lost a star? You would need observations extending over thousands of years. You would need precise enough attention to the cluster that a change in the number of visible members would be noticed and recorded. The Aboriginal Australian tradition claims to have noticed that change, and the timescale on which such a change would be observable is consistent with, though not proof of, a tradition of systematic astronomical observation extending over the full 65,000-year span of Aboriginal Australian presence on the continent. There is another piece of astronomical evidence that is equally striking. In the traditions of several Aboriginal communities, there are careful descriptions of the behavior of specific stars over seasonal timescales. Stars that are described as rising at particular points on the horizon at particular times of year, and this rising being connected to specific ecological events. The arrival of particular animal species, the ripening of particular plant foods, the timing of seasonal weather changes. These connections between astronomical observation and ecological calendar are not unusual in principle. Cultures around the world have made similar connections. What is unusual is the precision and the depth. The connections recorded in Aboriginal astronomical traditions have been cross-referenced against actual astronomical data and against ecological records, and the correlations are real. The stars do rise at the times described. The ecological events do happen at those times. The calendar works. A calendar that works requires not just luck, it requires systematic observation over long periods of time. It requires a tradition of recording those observations in a form that allows them to be passed down and checked against current observation. And the astronomical traditions of Aboriginal Australians show exactly that structure. They are not static myths. They are dynamic records that contain information precise enough to be verified against modern measurements. This is systematic astronomy. It is not astronomy of the kind that produces telescopes and mathematical models and space probes, but it is astronomy in the sense that matters most fundamentally, which is careful, precise, systematic observation of the sky and the recording of what is observed in a form that allows knowledge to accumulate across generations. And it has been ongoing for tens of thousands of years. The Australian continent itself has something to say in this story that we have not yet fully addressed. The geology of Australia is itself extraordinarily old. The rock formations of the Pilbara region in Western Australia include some of the oldest surface rocks on Earth, dating back more than 3 billion years. The Yilgarn Craton, the ancient geological core of the continent, is among the most stable and geologically ancient exposed landmasses on the planet. This is not incidental to the human story. The extraordinary geological age of the Australian continent creates conditions for the preservation of materials that would be destroyed more quickly on geologically active landscapes. The lack of major volcanic activity, the absence of deep glaciation in the interior, the dry climate of much of the continent, all of these factors contribute to a preservation environment that is in some ways more favorable for long-term archaeological preservation than most other places on Earth. This means that what survives in Australia from early human occupation is likely to be more representative of what was there than equivalent preservation in other regions. The rock art persists because the sandstone does not erode quickly, and the climate does not cycle through extremes that would spoil the rock faces. The ancient lakebed sediments at Mungo preserve materials that would be gone in a wetter environment. The stone tool assemblages in desert regions can sometimes be exposed by wind erosion of sediments without being chemically altered. The consequence of this, for archaeologists, is that the Australian record is not just old. It may be unusually complete by the standards of evidence from comparable time depths elsewhere. When you find something in the archaeological record of Australia from 40,000 years ago, you may be seeing a more representative sample of what was there than you would get from an equivalent age site on a geologically active continent. This makes the absence of things in the record informative in a way that absences in less well-preserved records are not. If stone tools of a particular type are not found in the Australian record after a certain date, you can have more confidence that it reflects their actual absence rather than a preservation failure. If certain behaviors appear and then disappear from the record, you can have more confidence that you are seeing a real cultural change rather than a taphonomic artifact. But the geological age of the continent also creates a mystery that sits outside the human story and nevertheless intersects with it in a remarkable way. Australia is isolated. It has been isolated for at least 40 million years, drifting north from Antarctica on its tectonic plate and eventually coming close enough to Asia to allow occasional biological exchange, but never close enough to allow the land bridge connections that periodically connected the other continents to each other. The result of 40 million years of isolation is a fauna and flora that evolved entirely independently from the rest of the world. The marsupial mammals, the monotremes, the extraordinary diversity of eucalyptus and acacia species, the birds of Australia, which include evolutionary lineages found nowhere else. All of this is the product of biological evolution on a continental island across a timescale that dwarfs even the 65,000-year human presence. When Aboriginal people arrived in Australia 65,000 years ago, they arrived on a continent that was already the product of an evolutionary experiment lasting 40 million years. They were stepping into a biological world unlike anything they or their ancestors had ever encountered. Every large animal was unfamiliar. Every tree and shrub belonged to families they had not seen before. The behavioral rules they had learned from a lifetime in Southeast Asia applied in modified form at best. And they figured it out. Within a remarkably short geological period, measured in thousands rather than millions of years, they had learned the ecology of the continent. They knew which plants were edible and which were toxic. They knew the behavior and migration patterns of the novel megafauna. They knew where the water was in an arid landscape that had evolved its hydrology without any consideration for the needs of large African apes. The speed of this adaptation, looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, is remarkable. It reflects the power of cultural learning, of the ability to observe, communicate, and transmit information across generations in ways that make biological evolution look slow. The Aboriginal Australians did not need to biologically adapt to Australia. They culturally adapted. Within a few thousand years of arrival, they had built up a body of ecological knowledge sufficient to survive and eventually thrive across the entire continent. And then they refined that knowledge for 60,000 more years. Now, let us turn to the connection that goes north. Not to India, which we have already discussed, but further north and west. To the question of whether there is any evidence of a connection between Aboriginal Australian culture and the ancient civilizations of the wider ancient world beyond what the genetics has already suggested. This is territory that requires careful handling, because it has historically attracted both serious researchers and people with agendas very different from serious research. The idea that ancient Egyptians visited Australia, or that Phoenician sailors reached the continent, or that Australian rock art contains representations of foreign visitors from ancient civilizations, has been circulating in popular literature for decades. Most of the specific claims in this popular literature are not supported by credible evidence. But the underlying question, whether there was any contact between Australia and the wider ancient world before European colonization, is not answered by dismissing those specific claims. The answer to that question is yes, there was contact. We know there was contact with Macassan traders from Indonesia in the centuries before European arrival. We know there was the Indian genetic signal 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. We know the dingo arrived from mainland Asia. The question is not whether any contact occurred. The question is, what the extent and nature of that contact was, and whether it left any traces beyond the genetic and zoological evidence. The answer that is emerging from recent research is that it probably left traces in the material culture and oral traditions that have not yet been fully analyzed, partly because the analytical framework for doing so has not existed until recently, and partly because the colonial disruption of Aboriginal culture broke many of the chains of transmission that would have preserved those traces most clearly. There is a body of rock art in the Kimberley region of Western Australia that depicts figures sometimes referred to as Wandjina. The Wandjina are ancestral creator beings in the oral traditions of several Kimberley language groups. They are depicted in a very distinctive style, with large round heads, no mouths, and elaborate headdresses or halos. The style is consistent and recognizable across the region and has been maintained in ceremonial art production into the present day. The Wandjina images have attracted attention from people who look at them and see, or claim to see, resemblances to figures in the religious iconography of distant cultures, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, various other ancient traditions that produced large-headed anthropomorphic figures in their art. The mainstream academic response to this is that the similarities are superficial, and that anthropomorphic art in many different traditions converges on similar forms because there are only so many ways to draw a stylized human figure. This response is probably correct in most cases, but there is a more interesting question underneath the superficial one. Not whether the Wandjina figures look like ancient Mesopotamian art. They do not, in any detailed sense. But whether the cosmological traditions that produce the Wandjina and the cosmological traditions that produce the great creator deities of the ancient Near East share any deep structural similarities that might reflect either a common, very ancient ancestry or some form of influence. This is a question that has not been systematically investigated. The disciplinary barriers between Australian Aboriginal studies and ancient Near Eastern studies are high, and the researchers who work in one area rarely have the expertise to work in the other. The comparison has been left, largely by default, to the popular literature, which has not handled it well. A proper comparative study of the cosmological structures across these traditions, conducted by researchers with expertise in both areas, might produce results that are genuinely informative about the deep history of religious and cosmological thinking. Or it might confirm that the similarities are superficial. Either result would be valuable. What we can say, from the evidence we do have, is that Aboriginal Australian cosmological traditions show a sophistication and a depth that is comparable to the cosmological traditions of civilizations that get much more scholarly attention. The dreaming as a theory of time and reality is not less sophisticated than the cosmological frameworks of ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. It is differently sophisticated, and it is much older. There is a concept in genetics called linkage disequilibrium, which describes the tendency of certain genetic variants to occur together more frequently than you would expect by chance. When two variants are physically close to each other on the same chromosome, they tend to be inherited together. And over many generations, the pattern of which variants occur together carries information about the history of the population. The Aboriginal Australian genome shows patterns of linkage disequilibrium that are different from those seen in other populations. The patterns reflect the long isolation of the population, the particular bottleneck events it went through on the route to Australia, and the subsequent evolution on the continent over 65,000 years. This is technically complex, but the implication is straightforward. Aboriginal Australian genomes are not just old in the sense of tracing back to old ancestors. They are old in the sense that the specific variants and combinations of variants they carry reflect 65,000 years of evolution in a specific place. They carry the signature of everything that happened to that population during that time. Every selection event, every population bottleneck, every period of isolation, and every period of connection. Reading that signature fully requires sequencing many Aboriginal Australian genomes and comparing them carefully. This work has been done to a limited extent but is far from complete. The number of Aboriginal Australian genomes in research databases is small relative to the number that would be needed to fully characterize the population's genetic structure. This is partly a resource issue. Genetic sequencing is expensive, though it is becoming dramatically cheaper, but it is also an ethical and relationship issue. Aboriginal communities have had experiences with research that extracted genetic material and information and produced results that were used in ways the communities had not consented to. There is a legacy of extractive research to be overcome before the trust required for large-scale genetic studies can be fully established. But when that work is eventually done, when the full depth and complexity of Aboriginal Australian genetic diversity is properly characterized, the results will change what we know about early human population history in ways that cannot be fully predicted. Among the things that might be revealed is a more complete picture of the ghost lineage, the unidentified ancestral component in Aboriginal Australian genomes. If enough genomes are sequenced and the analysis is sophisticated enough, it may be possible to characterize the ghost lineage more precisely, to identify its distinctive genetic variants, to look for those variants in other populations around the world and see whether any traces of it appear elsewhere. This could, in principle, identify the source population, or it could confirm that the ghost lineage is genuinely unknown, that the people who contributed it left no other detectable genetic trace in any modern population, that they are truly lost. Vanished except for this faint echo preserved in the genomes of Aboriginal Australians. The thought of a human population that existed, that lived and moved and contributed to the human story, and that left no archaeological trace we have found, and no genetic trace in any other living population, a ghost in every sense, is one of the most haunting ideas that emerges from modern genetics. They were real people. They had lives as complex and full and meaningful as any other human lives. They left their mark, invisibly, in the genome of people who did not know they were carrying it, who could not have known until the technology to read it was invented. And now that technology exists, and we can see the shape of their passing, even though we cannot see them, how many other ghost populations are out there in the human genetic record? How many lives, how many cultures, how many languages and traditions and cosmologies are encoded as faint signals in genomes we have not yet learned to fully read? The ghost lineage in Aboriginal Australian genomes is the one we know about, the one we have found. But the history of the human species is long enough and complex enough that there are almost certainly more. One of the most striking pieces of evidence from the deep past of Australia comes not from genetics or from rock art or from oral tradition, but from a discipline that might seem unlikely: linguistics. Specifically, from the work being done to understand what happened to Australian languages just before and around the time of the Indian genetic contribution 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Languages, like genes, change over time. And like genes, the rate and pattern of change carry information about population history. When a new population arrives in an area and mixes with the existing population, it leaves traces in the language as well as the genome. Loanwords from the new arrival's language, grammatical influences, changes in phonology. The nature and extent of these traces can sometimes tell you something about the nature of the contact. Around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, there appears to have been a significant restructuring in Australian language families. The Pama-Nyungan family, which now covers most of the continent, appears to have expanded dramatically during this period. Earlier, the linguistic landscape of Australia was more diverse, with many non-Pama-Nyungan languages spread across a larger area. Then, relatively rapidly in linguistic terms, Pama-Nyungan languages spread across most of the continent, displacing or absorbing many of the earlier language groups. What caused this expansion? The timing is suggestive. The Pama-Nyungan expansion corresponds approximately with the period of the Indian genetic signal and the arrival of the dingo. If a population connected to Indian genetics arrived in Australia around that time, bringing new technologies and new animals, they may have also set off processes of cultural and demographic change that drove the Pama-Nyungan expansion. Or the causal relationship may run the other way. The Pama-Nyungan expansion may have been driven by internal Australian dynamics, and the Indian genetic signal may be a separate phenomenon, or both may be caused by a third factor we have not yet identified. The linguistic evidence is consistent with significant contact and population movement around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, but it does not, by itself, determine the direction of causation. This is the kind of puzzle that requires integrating multiple lines of evidence, each of which is compatible with several possible histories, and finding the interpretation that best fits all the evidence simultaneously. The researchers working on this puzzle are doing exactly that, and the interpretations they are developing are increasingly sophisticated and increasingly capable of distinguishing between hypotheses that would look the same if you only examined one line of evidence, but look different when you look at several. The answer is not yet clear, but the work is moving toward an answer. And when it comes, it will tell us something important about one of the most interesting events in Australian prehistory, an event that reshaped the cultural landscape of the continent in ways whose full implications we are only beginning to understand. There is another linguistic thread that connects Australia to the broader story of human prehistory in a way that is even more speculative but intriguing. Some linguists working on the deep history of language families have proposed connections between Australian language families and language families elsewhere in the world. Connections that, if real, would imply shared ancestry reaching back to the period of the original human dispersal. These proposals are extremely controversial. Historical linguistics has well-established methods for demonstrating language relationship, methods that require specific types of systematic correspondence between languages across multiple grammatical and phonological features. The claimed connections between Australian languages and distant language families have generally not met these standards, or have not met them convincingly enough to achieve consensus. But the question is worth asking. If Aboriginal Australian people have been present in Australia for 65,000 years, and if their languages have been evolving continuously during that time, then the languages spoken today represent 65,000 years of divergence from whatever language or languages the founding population spoke. The depth of that divergence means that connections to other language families, if they exist, would be essentially invisible to standard historical linguistics methods, which cannot reliably reconstruct language history beyond 8,000 to 10,000 years. In other words, even if Australian languages and some other language family share a common ancestor from 65,000 years ago, we probably cannot demonstrate that relationship through the standard methods. The shared ancestry would be too old to leave recoverable traces in the modern languages. This is a fundamental limitation of historical linguistics that applies to many questions about the deep human past. The languages spoken 65,000 years ago are completely beyond the reach of linguistic reconstruction. All we can hope to recover is the structure of divergence over the last few thousand years, which tells us about events in the recent past, but not about the origins. The picture that emerges from everything we have covered so far is not simple. It is not a story that resolves into a clean narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. It is the opposite of that. It is a story that keeps opening up, that keeps revealing new dimensions, that keeps connecting to broader questions in ways that make it impossible to contain. But there is a coherent center to it. And the center is this. There is a population of human beings that has been present on a specific landmass for 65,000 years. During that time, they developed a civilization. Not in the narrow sense that word has come to mean, with its implication of cities and writing and the specific institutions that European academics decided were markers of civilizational achievement. But in the broader sense, a sophisticated, adaptive, intellectually rich response to the challenge of living as a human community across deep time. That civilization produced astronomical traditions sophisticated enough to encode accurate data about stellar variability across observation periods spanning thousands of years. It produced oral traditions that preserve accurate accounts of geological events that happened 12,000 years ago. It produced land management systems that shaped the ecology of an entire continent. It produced a knowledge transmission system capable of maintaining accurate information across 600 generations without writing. and it produced something that nothing else on Earth has produced, a 65,000-year-old bloodline, a genetic record of human presence on a specific landmass stretching back to within a few thousand years of the original human dispersal out of Africa. That bloodline, preserved in the genomes of Aboriginal Australians living today, carries within it the signatures of every major event in its history. The deep African ancestry, the archaic admixture from Neanderthals and Denisovans and the ghost population, the founder effect of the crossing to Sahul, the long Australian isolation, the Indian contribution 4,000 years ago. Each event leaving its mark in the genetic structure of the population, readable now by techniques that did not exist 30 years ago. The bloodline is the record. The culture is the record. The land itself is the record, shaped by 65,000 years of human management and encoded with information in the form of the song lines that traverse it. This is not just history. It is an ongoing reality. The Aboriginal people who carry this bloodline are not relics of the past. They are living people with living cultures, living on the same continent their ancestors have occupied for 65,000 years, holding knowledge that exists nowhere else, facing the consequences of 250 years of catastrophic disruption, and making choices about what to maintain and what to change and how to move forward. The researchers and the science are catching up to a story that Aboriginal people have always known, that their culture is old, that their knowledge is deep, that their connection to country is not metaphorical but real, spanning a time depth that most people cannot meaningfully imagine. The science is not discovering the truth of the Aboriginal Australian story. The science is finding the tools to translate that story into a language that the Western world can accept as evidence. The story itself has been there all along, in the songlines and the oral traditions and the ceremonial knowledge and the 65,000-year bloodline running forward unbroken from the dawn of the human world. The Denisovans deserve more time than we have given them, because they are central to the Aboriginal Australian genetic story in a way that is still generating new discoveries. When the Denisovan genome was first sequenced in 2010, the researchers estimated that Denisovan DNA in modern humans was most concentrated in Melanesia and Australia, at levels of 4 to 6%. This was interpreted as evidence that the interbreeding between Denisovans and the ancestors of these populations happened somewhere in the region between mainland Asia and Australia, probably in island Southeast Asia. But subsequent work has complicated that picture in interesting ways. The Denisovan DNA found in different populations is not all the same Denisovan DNA. There appear to be at least 2 distinct episodes of interbreeding with distinct groups of Denisovans. One that contributed to the ancestry of populations in mainland Asia, and another that contributed to the ancestry of Melanesians and Australian Aboriginals. The 2 groups of Denisovans that contributed to these different modern populations were themselves genetically quite different, suggesting they had been separated from each other for a long time. This means the Denisovan range was enormous. They were present across a vast area of Asia and Island, Southeast Asia, and the different populations within their range had diverged enough from each other to be distinguishable in the genomes of their descendants thousands of years later. The Denisovans were not a small, isolated population. They were a successful, widespread human species that occupied much of the Eastern Old World for an extended period. And they are almost entirely unknown to us. We have found exactly 2 fossil sites with confirmed Denisovan material. The cave in Siberia, where the original discovery was made, and a cave on the Tibetan Plateau, where a jawbone was found and confirmed as Denisovan by protein analysis in 2019. 2 sites, for a species that apparently ranged across most of Asia and interbred with the ancestors of one of the most genetically diverse modern human populations on Earth. The Denisovans are the great missing chapter of human prehistory, more widespread than Neanderthals, arguably, based on the genetic evidence, and essentially invisible in the fossil record. The only reason we know they existed at all is because their descendants carry their DNA. In Aboriginal Australian genomes, the Denisovan signal is at its highest. This means Aboriginal Australians are, in a sense, the primary living carriers of Denisovan heritage. 4 to 6% Denisovan ancestry is not trivial. It is more than enough to potentially contribute meaningfully to various physical and physiological traits, though identifying which specific traits reflect Denisovan ancestry versus modern human ancestry is extremely difficult. There is evidence that some Denisovan genetic variants contributed adaptive advantages to modern humans who carry them. The EPAS1 gene variant found in Tibetan populations, which helps them process oxygen efficiently at high altitude, has been traced to Denisovan ancestry. This is a clear case where an adaptive trait was acquired not through mutation in the modern human population, but through interbreeding with an archaic population that had already evolved that adaptation. Are there Denisovan-derived adaptive variants in Aboriginal Australian genomes? The question has been asked, but not fully answered. The genome-wide search for evidence of positive selection on Denisovan-derived variants in Aboriginal Australian populations has not yet been done comprehensively. When it is done, it may reveal that the Denisovan contribution to Aboriginal Australian biology is not just historical. That specific traits, specific physiological capacities, specific immune system properties are Denisovan in origin. The land that Aboriginal people have occupied for 65,000 years is harsh and variable in ways that imposed strong selection on the populations living there. The arid interior, with its extreme heat and episodic water scarcity, the tropical north with its monsoonal rainfall and different disease environment, the temperate south with its seasonal extremes. Surviving across all of these environments required not just cultural adaptation, but biological adaptation. The Denisovan genetic contribution, acquired before the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians arrived in Australia, may have included adaptive variants that made survival in Australian environments more achievable. We do not know this yet, but the question is open and the tools to answer it exist. Let us talk about the outback, not as a geographic term, not as a tourist category, but as the specific and extraordinary environment that Aboriginal Australians have been navigating, surviving in, and managing for more than 50,000 years. The Australian interior is one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Simpson Desert, the Gibson Desert, the Great Victoria Desert, the Nullarbor Plain. These are places where summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, where annual rainfall may be measured in millimeters, where water sources are separated by distances that would be lethal to an unprepared traveler. And Aboriginal Australians lived in all of them. Not just survived in them, lived in them, maintained communities, conducted ceremony, preserved the full complexity of their cultural traditions. In some of the most inhospitable environments that the terrestrial world offers. How? The answer is knowledge, specifically the knowledge of water. In a desert environment, the ability to find water is the difference between life and death. Not general knowledge of the type of knowledge that says there is probably water in that direction. Precise knowledge. The knowledge of specific soaks and rock holes and tree roots that contain moisture. The knowledge of which plant species indicate subsurface water. The knowledge of how to read the behavior of birds and insects to find water at dawn and dusk. The knowledge of which sand formations hide underground water accessible by digging. This knowledge is not written down anywhere. It is carried in the songlines, in the oral traditions, in the ceremonial knowledge passed between generations. And it covers the entire interior of the continent. Every significant water source, every reliable and every intermittent source has its place in the knowledge system, its location, its seasonal reliability, its quality, the conditions under which it is safe to use. The interior of Australia, which European explorers consistently found lethal, which killed Burke and Wills and several other famous attempts to traverse it, was navigated routinely by Aboriginal people for tens of thousands of years using this knowledge. The contrast is stark enough to deserve repetition. European expeditions with horses and food supplies and compasses died trying to cross the Australian interior. Aboriginal people, with no equivalent technology, but with 60,000 years of accumulated knowledge of the specific landscape, navigated it routinely. This is what knowledge of place means at its deepest level. Not general knowledge about deserts, not textbook knowledge about geology or hydrology. Specific, granular, intimate knowledge of specific places, accumulated over tens of thousands of years by people who lived there and died there and passed their knowledge to children who did the same. That knowledge is the most sophisticated desert navigation system that has ever existed. And it was developed in Australia, in the cultural traditions of the people who have been there the longest, through a process of observation and transmission that has been ongoing for longer than any comparable tradition anywhere on Earth. We have been talking about connections and mysteries, about the things the genetics reveals, and the things the archaeology suggests, and the things the oral traditions preserve. But there is another dimension to this story that we have touched on but not fully addressed. The dimension of what Aboriginal Australian culture was doing with all of that time. 65,000 years is not a neutral interval. It is not simply a very long time to be sitting still. During 65,000 years, things happen. Cultures evolve. Knowledge accumulates. Social structures develop and refine and sometimes transform entirely. What was Aboriginal Australian culture doing during those 65,000 years? This is a question that is genuinely difficult to answer because the evidence available is so fragmentary relative to the actual complexity of what was happening. The archaeological record tells us some things, but not others. The oral traditions tell us some things, but not others. The genetics tells us about population, structure, and movement, but not about cultural content. But there are glimpses. The technology of the continent changed during the human occupation. Early tools were replaced by new forms. The backing technology, which produces small, sharp stone tools designed to be hafted into composite implements, appeared in the record roughly 10,000 years ago and spread rapidly across the continent. The grinding stones used to process seeds appear in the record at various sites, becoming more common over time. The social and ceremonial structures that maintained the songlines and the broader knowledge system almost certainly evolved in complexity during the long occupation. These changes tell us that Aboriginal Australian culture was not static. It was adaptive, responsive to environmental change and to internal cultural dynamics. The 65,000-year span was not 65,000 years of the same thing. It was 65,000 years of change and adaptation and development. But the rate of change, compared to the agricultural and then industrial civilizations that developed elsewhere, was different. Not slower in any simple sense. Different. Following different priorities. Optimizing for different outcomes. Agricultural civilization optimizes for population density and technological output. More people per square kilometer. More material production per person. More rapid change in the material conditions of life. These are real achievements, and they have produced things of genuine value, including the science that we have been discussing throughout this account. But they have also produced things of genuine cost, ecological degradation, resource depletion, social hierarchies that concentrate wealth and power in ways that make the lives of most people in those civilizations worse than the lives of people in less intensively managed social systems. The archaeological record of early agricultural populations consistently shows the population getting shorter, less healthy, more disease-ridden, and working harder than the hunter-gatherer populations they replaced or displaced. Aboriginal Australian culture, optimizing over 65,000 years for something different, produced a different set of outcomes. It did not produce more people per square kilometer. The population of Australia before European contact is estimated at somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million people across a continent the size of the continental United States. This is low density by any modern standard. But those people were, by the measures we have discussed, living well within the ecological capacity of their environment. They had more leisure than agricultural peoples. Their diets were more diverse and more nutritious than early agricultural diets. Their knowledge systems were more resilient across time than written traditions have proven to be. And they did it for 65,000 years without depleting the resources of the continent to the point of civilizational collapse. European and Asian civilizations have collapsed regularly across their much shorter histories. The Western Roman Empire, the Mycenaean civilization, the classic Maya, the Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. Over and over, The civilizational model that prioritizes population density and material output runs into resource constraints or political instabilities that produce catastrophic collapse. Aboriginal Australian civilization did not collapse. It adapted. It persisted for 65,000 years. That is the most extraordinary achievement in the human record, the most remarkable example of civilizational resilience and adaptive capacity that our species has produced, and we have barely started learning what it means. Now we come to what might be the most provocative question that the Aboriginal Australian evidence raises, not about the past, but about the future. If the oldest bloodline on Earth, the oldest continuous culture on Earth, the most resilient civilizational tradition in the human record, survived and adapted for 65,000 years before being catastrophically disrupted by colonization, what does that tell us about what human civilization is capable of if we get the priorities right? We're in a period when the dominant civilizational model, the one built on the expansion of agriculture and then industry, is producing consequences that are threatening its own long-term viability. Climate change, biodiversity collapse, resource depletion, the accumulation of pollutants in every ecosystem on Earth. These are the consequences of a civilizational model that is optimized for short-term output at the expense of long-term sustainability. The Aboriginal Australian model optimized for the opposite: long-term sustainability at the expense of short-term output. This is not a simple lesson. You cannot simply transfer the Aboriginal Australian model to the modern world. The world has 7 billion people who need to eat and have access to medicine and communication and the other things that modern civilization provides. The scale is entirely different. But the principle, the idea that civilization can be optimized for sustainability across deep time rather than for short-term output, and that this optimization produces outcomes that are in many ways superior for human well-being, is a principle that the Aboriginal Australian case demonstrates has been achieved in practice. Not theoretically, not as a philosophical argument. In practice, across 65,000 years of actual human experience on an actual continent. The fire management knowledge that Aboriginal Australians developed and maintained is being actively investigated and in some cases implemented in Australia today as a response to the catastrophic wildfire crisis. The land management principles embedded in Aboriginal ecological knowledge are being studied by conservation ecologists looking for more sustainable approaches to managing Australian ecosystems. The water knowledge of desert communities is being documented and in some cases incorporated into water management planning for arid regions. This is not nostalgia for a pre-modern way of life. It is the recognition that 65,000 years of accumulated practical knowledge about how to live sustainably on a specific landscape is a resource, a genuinely valuable resource, that cannot be replaced by any amount of new scientific data collection. The ecological knowledge is not all that can be carried forward. The social knowledge, the structures that maintained information across generations, the ceremonial systems that created obligations to the future as well as to the past, the relational frameworks that governed the use of shared resources, all of these contain practical wisdom about how to maintain functional human communities across long timescales. We are only beginning to ask these questions, only beginning to engage with Aboriginal Australian knowledge as a source of genuine intellectual content rather than simply as a cultural curiosity. The conversation is difficult, complicated by the history of colonialism and the justified skepticism of Aboriginal communities about the intentions of researchers and governments, but it is beginning. And what is coming out of that conversation, slowly and carefully, is the recognition that the oldest bloodline on Earth is carrying knowledge that the youngest civilizations desperately need. We have traveled a long way through this story, from the first people leaving Africa 65,000 years ago, through the Blue Water crossing to Sahul, through 50,000 years of accumulating knowledge and cultural development, through the genetic mysteries and the astronomical traditions and the geological memories, through the connections to India and the ghost populations and the population Y signal in Amazonian genomes. We have covered a great deal. But the story is not finished. It cannot be finished because the research is not finished, and the research is not finished because the questions it is asking have not been fully answered. The ghost lineage has not been identified. The source of the population Y signal in Amazonian populations has not been determined. The full depth and diversity of Aboriginal Australian genetic variation has not been characterized. The astronomical traditions have not been fully analyzed for the information they might contain about stellar observations across deep time. The oldest rock art has not been fully dated or documented. The connections between Aboriginal oral traditions and the geological and ecological records of the past have only been examined in a handful of cases. There is a vast amount of work still to be done, and the work is genuinely important, not just academically, but in the broader sense of human self-knowledge. We are still in the early stages of understanding who we are, where we came from, and what we are capable of. The Aboriginal Australian case is one of the most important single datasets in that larger inquiry. The bloodline that runs from the earliest modern humans through the crossing of Sahul to the present day is not just the oldest bloodline on Earth in the trivial sense of having the deepest ancestry. It is the oldest in the meaningful sense that it has been here, in one place, accumulating knowledge and experience and genetic diversity and cultural complexity for longer than any other comparable human lineage outside Africa. That continuity is, in itself, one of the most remarkable facts about the human species. That a group of humans could arrive on a continent and maintain themselves there, maintain their language and their ceremony and their relationships with country and each other, across a time span so long that it encompasses the entire rise and fall of every other civilization that has ever existed on Earth. Not just once, but hundreds of times. Not just survive, but accumulate, building a depth of knowledge and cultural complexity that took tens of thousands of years to develop and cannot be replicated. That is what we are talking about when we talk about the oldest bloodline on Earth. Not a primitive survival, not a static, unchanging way of life, not a remnant of humanity's past, a living, evolving, complex human civilization that has been operating for 65,000 years, and that contains within it a record of human experience that is available nowhere else in the world. The things inside that bloodline that should not be possible are not supernatural. They are the product of time and accumulated knowledge and cultural sophistication operating at a scale and depth that the rest of the human world has not experienced. But in their own way, they are as surprising as anything supernatural could be. Because the implications of what the genetics and the archaeology and the oral traditions and the astronomical observations and the ecological knowledge are all pointing to is something that the conventional human story was not prepared for. That the most sophisticated long-term human project in the history of our species was not Egypt or Rome or China or Greece. That it was not any of the civilizations that Western education considers foundational. That it was something older and deeper, and in crucial respects more impressive than any of those. And that it was happening in Australia, in the land of the oldest bloodline, in the culture of the people who have been there the longest, and who carry, in their genes and their song lines and their traditions and their knowledge of country, a record of the human story so deep that we are only now, with the tools of modern genomics and cross-disciplinary research and slowly building trust between researchers and communities, beginning to be able to read it. What we find, as we learn to read it, keeps being more remarkable than what came before. And it is not stopping. There is one more thing that the Aboriginal Australian story teaches us about what should not be possible, about what human memory is capable of when it is treated not as a cognitive burden to be offloaded onto external storage, but as a living capacity to be exercised and maintained and passed forward with deliberate care. The modern world has developed extraordinary external memory systems: writing, printing, photography, recording, digital storage. The internet. We can store more information externally than any previous civilization, and we can retrieve it faster and more precisely than any previous storage system allowed. But we have also, as we have developed these external systems, allowed our internal memory capacities to atrophy. The practice of committing long texts to memory, which was standard in many pre-literate and early literate cultures, is essentially absent from modern education. The skills of memorization that allowed medieval scholars to carry entire books in their heads, that allowed ancient epic poets to compose and recite works of thousands of lines without written notes, these skills are not being cultivated in most modern educational systems because the external storage is available, and it seems to make the internal storage unnecessary. What the Aboriginal Australian case suggests is that the internal storage, the living human memory, trained and maintained and structured through appropriate cultural practices, has capacities that we have not fully explored. The information densities achieved by Aboriginal oral traditions are far beyond anything that modern research has demonstrated for trained memorization in Western contexts. The combination of narrative structure, musical encoding in song, spatial grounding in the landscape, social enforcement through ceremony, and long chains of transmission has produced an information storage system that has maintained accurate content for time depths that Western research on memory simply does not have reference points for. We do not know the upper limit of this capacity because we have never had a tradition with 65,000 years to explore it. The implications extend beyond anthropology. There is active research in cognitive science on what is sometimes called the method of loci or memory palace technique, an ancient mnemonic method that uses spatial imagery to dramatically increase the amount of information that can be held in memory. This technique was known to the ancient Greeks and Romans, was used extensively in medieval Europe, and is currently being investigated as a potential tool for enhancing memory in both educational and therapeutic contexts. The songlines of Aboriginal Australia are, among other things, a highly developed version of the method of loci applied at continental scale. The entire Australian landscape is a memory palace. Every feature of the terrain is a hook for information. The spatial grounding of the songlines across real, physical geography creates a memory structure so robust that it has maintained information, demonstrably, for at least 12,000 years. What could a deliberately designed and maintained educational system do with this knowledge? What would education look like if it took seriously the possibility that human memory, properly trained and maintained, can store and transmit information over timescales that seem impossible by the standards of what we currently attempt to train for? These questions are beginning to be asked by researchers at the intersection of cognitive science, Aboriginal studies, and education theory. The answers, when they come, may be among the most practically significant findings that come out of engaging seriously with the Aboriginal Australian case. Because the implications are not just historical, they are not just about understanding the past. The capacity for deep memory that the songlines demonstrate exists in every human brain. It is a human capacity, not an exclusively Aboriginal one. What Aboriginal culture did was develop the cultural tools to train and maintain and transmit that capacity across generations. Those tools were developed over 65,000 years of refinement. We are only beginning to understand what they are. And when we do understand them, the oldest bloodline on Earth will have given the rest of humanity a gift more significant than anything it has previously recognized. There are things in the Aboriginal Australian story that science is currently not equipped to fully address. Not because they are supernatural, but because the tools and the frameworks for doing so have not yet been developed. This is different from saying they are impossible. It is saying they are at the frontier, in the territory where what is known ends and what might become known begins. One of those things is the precise mechanism by which the coastal flooding memories were preserved for 12,000 years. We can observe that they were preserved. We can note that the cultural structures of ceremony and transmission and the connection of specific knowledge to specific country provided a framework for preservation. But the precise cognitive and social mechanisms by which accurate information is maintained across 600 generations, including during periods of disruption, warfare, disease, and demographic collapse, are not fully understood. This is a genuine scientific question with practical implications. If we could understand the mechanisms more precisely, we could potentially use them to design more robust educational systems, better knowledge transmission programs, more effective conservation of endangered knowledge systems. The Australian case provides the most extreme example of these mechanisms in action, which makes it the most valuable test case for developing that understanding. Another frontier question concerns the astronomical traditions. The observation that Aboriginal traditions contain accurate data about stellar variability is documented. What is not yet known is the full extent of the astronomical knowledge encoded in those traditions. How many stars have associated traditions that contain accurate observational data? What is the oldest stellar observation that can be confirmed? Are there traditions that encode data about phenomena that modern astronomers have not yet detected or confirmed from other sources? These questions have been approached only very carefully and in limited cases. A systematic survey of Aboriginal astronomical traditions, conducted with the cooperation and direction of Aboriginal elders and communities, could produce results of genuine scientific significance, not just for the history of astronomy. For astronomy itself, if some of the traditions turn out to encode observations of phenomena that modern observation has not yet confirmed, this would be one of the most extraordinary outcomes imaginable. Ancient oral traditions providing data to modern science rather than the other way around. But given what has already been confirmed about the accuracy of Aboriginal geological and astronomical traditions, it is not an outcome that should be dismissed. A third frontier area concerns the question of what was on the Australian continental shelf before it was submerged. The rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age drowned somewhere between 2 and 3 million square kilometers of the Sahul landmass. That is an area roughly equivalent to the current size of Western Australia, now under between 10 and 100 meters of water in the shallow seas around the continent. What was on that land? Human populations had been living on it for tens of thousands of years before it was submerged. The coastline environments of ancient Sahul would have been among the most productive and densely populated parts of the continent, as coastal environments tend to be. The resource-rich intertidal zones, the river mouths, the shallow bays, all would have supported human populations. Those populations left archaeological traces. Their campsites, their middens, their tools, their burials, all of those traces are now underwater. Some of the most important archaeological sites in Australian prehistory may be sitting on the submerged continental shelf, completely inaccessible without underwater archaeology. The same phenomenon applies to the Sunderland Shelf, the drowned extension of Southeast Asia, where the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians passed through on their way to Sahul. The submerged continental shelves of Southeast Asia and Australia are among the most archaeologically significant unexplored regions on Earth. The technology to do underwater archaeology at those depths exists, though it is expensive and logistically complex. When the resources and the will to do so converge, what is found under those waters may fundamentally change what we know about the early human occupation of the region. The story of the Aboriginal bloodline is in part a story about isolation. The 65,000 years on a single continent, the deep divergence of the genetic lineage, the independent development of cultural and knowledge systems. But it is also, on closer examination, a story about connection. The connections that the genetics reveals across the deep human past. The contact with India 4,000 years ago, the Macassan contact, the population Y signal in South America, the Denisovan ancestry shared with populations across Southeast Asia. The isolation was never absolute. Australia was not a hermetically sealed world. People moved, contacts happened, genes flowed, occasionally, between the Australian population and the wider world. What was extraordinary was not total isolation, but the degree to which the Australian lineage maintained its distinctiveness through those contacts. The Indian genetic signal did not overwhelm the existing population. It contributed a small component and was absorbed. The Macassan contact did not transform Aboriginal culture into Macassan culture. It was incorporated, on Aboriginal terms, into an existing and deeply rooted cultural tradition. This selective absorption, this capacity to engage with outside influences without being overwhelmed by them, is itself a remarkable property of the culture. It reflects the depth and robustness of the existing tradition. When your cultural identity is grounded in 65,000 years of continuous relationship with specific country, in a songline network that covers an entire continent, in ceremonial obligations that connect you to the dreaming and through the dreaming to every generation that came before, a contact with traders from Sulawesi is interesting and potentially valuable, but it is not existentially threatening. You know who you are in a way that makes it possible to engage with the other without being consumed by it. This is a form of cultural security that is genuinely rare. Most cultures, when they come into contact with more technologically powerful or economically dominant cultures, find that the contact transforms or destroys the existing tradition over time. Aboriginal Australian culture engaged with neighbours and occasional visitors for 65,000 years and maintained its essential character through all of it. What could not be withstood was not the occasional contact with trading partners. What could not be withstood was sustained colonial occupation, the physical removal of people from their country, the forcible separation of children from the cultural transmission chain, the legal prohibition of language and ceremony. These were not contacts that could be selectively absorbed. These were direct attacks on the mechanisms of cultural transmission itself. Even so, the culture survived, diminished, disrupted, with gaps and fractures in the knowledge transmission chain that will never be fully repaired. But surviving, still carrying the song lines, still conducting ceremony, still maintaining the relationship with country that is the center of the tradition, still producing children who will learn what can be learned and carry it forward. The resilience is not surprising, given what we know about the 65,000-year record. A tradition that survived multiple ice ages and mega-droughts and sea level changes and the extinction of the megafauna and countless other disruptions over 60 millennia has reserves of adaptive capacity that do not evaporate in 250 years, however brutal those years were. The bloodline continues. The culture continues. The songlines are still there, encoded in living memory, waiting to be fully understood by a world that is only beginning to appreciate what they contain. The genetic research on Aboriginal Australians is accelerating. In 2016, a major genomic study of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans provided the most comprehensive genetic analysis to that date of these populations and their place in the human family tree. The study confirmed the deep divergence of the Aboriginal Australian lineage, confirmed the Denisovan ancestry, and added new detail about the internal structure of the population. One of the most significant findings from that study was evidence for multiple distinct founding lineages within Australia. Not a single founding population that spread across the continent, but evidence of distinct lineages within the continent that have been separate from each other for very long periods of time. This suggests that the founding of Australia was not a single event. Either multiple distinct groups crossed to Sahul at different times, or the initial founding population was large enough and spread quickly enough that regional populations began diverging from each other almost immediately and have been largely separate since. Either interpretation is remarkable. If multiple groups arrived at different times, then there were multiple independent crossings of the open water between Sunderland and Sahul. Multiple groups of people with the navigational knowledge and the seaworthy vessels to make that crossing. Multiple deliberate migrations to a continent that was new to the human world. If the single founding population was large and spread rapidly, then the initial colonization of an entire continent took place on a timescale fast enough that regional populations were established and separated before they had time to fully homogenize, which implies both a substantial initial population size and an extremely rapid dispersal across the landmass. Neither of these interpretations is simple. Both of them describe a founding event or founding process that was more complex and more impressive than the simple story of a small group of people wandering onto a new continent by accident. The 2016 study also provided more detail about the relationship between Aboriginal Australians and Papuans. The two populations share a common ancestor, consistent with their shared occupation of the Sahul landmass, but they have been genetically separated for a long time, accumulating distinct regional variants. The relationship between them reflects the separation that occurred as rising sea levels recreated the Torres Strait and separated New Guinea from Australia around 10,000 years ago. That separation event, the flooding of the Torres Strait, is itself recorded in Aboriginal oral traditions. Stories about a time when you could walk from Australia to the north, stories about the flooding that created the islands. The sea level data and the Aboriginal traditions agree on the basic outline of what happened. More recent genetic work has begun to examine the internal structure of Aboriginal Australian genetic diversity at finer scale, looking at the relationships between different regional groups and tracing the patterns of movement and separation within the continent over the past 50,000 years. The picture that is emerging is of a highly structured population, with regional groups that have been largely distinct for very long periods of time, but with evidence of movement and contact along specific corridors that correspond to the songline network. The routes along which genes flowed are, in many cases, the same routes along which the songlines run. The songlines are not just cultural infrastructure. They are also the infrastructure along which genetic material moved through the continent over 50,000 years. The ceremonial networks and the genetic networks are, in large measure, the same network. This is another dimension of the deep integration between the cultural system and the living human reality of the population. The ceremonies that maintained the songlines were also the occasions on which people from different groups met, exchanged partners, and introduced new genetic material into each other's populations. The knowledge transmission system and the reproductive network were one and the same thing. There is a site in the Northern Territory that most people have heard of, though most people do not know the full depth of what it represents. Kakadu National Park. World Heritage listed for both its natural and cultural values, famous for its landscapes and its wildlife and its rock art. The rock art of Kakadu spans at least 20,000 years of continuous production. Images layered over each other on the same rock faces as different generations added to the gallery, each layer reflecting the cultural and ecological context of its time. The oldest images, in the deepest layers, depict animals that are no longer present in the region, species that have gone locally extinct. The changing fauna of the region across 20,000 years, recorded in paint on sandstone. But Kakadu's art is not just an ecological record. It is a theological record, a record of changing cosmological traditions across 20,000 years. Different periods show different styles, different subject matter, different concerns. The X-ray art period, in which animals and humans are depicted with their internal organs visible, a style that seems to be about the relationship between the outer and inner dimensions of beings. The dynamic figures period, with its energetic depictions of human activity. The more recent periods, with their incorporation of new elements and their reflection of historical contact and change. Reading the Kakadu rock art sequence is reading a cosmological history, a 20,000-year record of how people in that place understood their relationship to the spiritual and natural worlds. Not a static tradition, but an evolving one, incorporating new ideas and experiences while maintaining continuity with what came before. And Kakadu is just one site within the broader rock art tradition of Northern Australia. Across Arnhem Land and the Kimberley and other regions, similar traditions of continuous production span similarly extraordinary time depths. The combined rock art record of Australia is the longest continuous visual record of human intellectual and spiritual development on Earth. It has barely been systematically studied. The vast majority of sites are not fully documented. Dating of individual images is technically difficult and has been done only at a small fraction of sites. When the full documentation and analysis of this record is eventually accomplished, it will constitute one of the most significant contributions to human self-knowledge that archaeological research has produced. A 20,000-year to 50,000-year record of how human minds engaged with the great questions, told in images, preserved in stone, across the continent that holds the oldest bloodline on Earth. The connections between the rock art record and the genetic record and the oral tradition record and the astronomical tradition record will become clearer as all of these bodies of evidence are more fully developed. As they do, the picture of Aboriginal Australian civilization that emerges will become richer and more detailed and more astonishing. We are at the beginning of that process. The foundations have been laid, the research traditions are in place, the relationships between researchers and communities that make the work possible are being built. The tools for extracting information from very ancient biological and cultural materials are advancing rapidly. What is coming is a significantly different picture of Aboriginal Australian civilization than the one that exists in popular understanding today. A picture that will show not just a very old culture, but one of the most remarkable human achievements in history. A 65,000-year civilization that left no pyramids and no written texts, but left something more durable than either. A living people, carrying a living culture, with a living connection to the oldest human bloodline outside Africa, still walking the country that their ancestors walked 65,000 years ago. There is a question that comes up whenever people encounter the Aboriginal Australian story for the first time in its full depth, and it is worth addressing directly. If this is all true, if the Aboriginal Australian bloodline is as old as the genetics says, and the culture is as sophisticated as the evidence suggests, and the knowledge systems are as impressive as the oral tradition research indicates, then why did this civilization not produce the same material achievements as civilizations in other parts of the world? Why no cities? Why no writing? Why no metal technology? It is a reasonable question, and it deserves a serious answer. The answer begins with geography and ecology. Australia is a continent of extremes. It is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. It has no major mountain ranges to catch monsoon rainfall and no large river systems comparable to the Nile or the Yangtze or the Ganges. Its soils, in most regions, are ancient and nutrient-poor by the standards of the younger, volcanism-enriched soils of Europe and Asia and the Americas. The continent's ecology is adapted to these conditions, but it is not, in most regions, a landscape that naturally supports the population densities that agriculture generates. Where agriculture did develop elsewhere, the underlying ecology supported it. The Fertile Crescent had rich alluvial soils and reliable rainfall and wild grasses that were easy to domesticate. The river valleys of China had similar conditions. The highlands of Mexico and Peru had native plant species that could be domesticated into highly productive crops. Australia did not have these conditions in the same way. The native grasses and plants of Australia are adapted to poor soils and irregular rainfall. They are harder to domesticate in the forms that produce the high yields that support dense populations. The ecological foundation for the development of intensive agriculture simply was not present across most of the continent in the same way it was in the regions where agriculture did develop. This is not a failure of Aboriginal Australians to think of agriculture. It is a recognition that the development of agriculture is not primarily a matter of cleverness. It is primarily a matter of having the right ecological substrate to work with. Given different starting conditions, Aboriginal Australians would likely have developed the same kinds of modifications to their environment that peoples in other parts of the world developed when they had the right conditions. And in fact, the evidence from Budjbim, and from the fire management traditions, and from the yam and grass management practices documented in some regions, suggests that Aboriginal Australians were doing precisely what the ecological conditions of Australia allowed them to do, intensifying food production through landscape management within the constraints of an environment that required different solutions than the ones that worked in the Fertile Crescent. The second part of the answer concerns what cities and writing are actually for. Cities are, fundamentally, a way of concentrating population in a location that generates the conditions for specialization of labor, for the accumulation of surplus, and for the maintenance of the institutional infrastructure that complex states require. They emerged in places where intensive agriculture made high population density possible, and where the economic and political systems produced by that density generated both the need for cities and the resources to build and maintain them. Writing emerged as a record-keeping technology for the complex administrative and commercial transactions of early urban economies. It is an information storage and transmission technology developed in response to needs that cities create. If you do not have cities, you do not need writing in the same way. If your information storage and transmission needs are being met by a 65,000-year-old oral tradition of extraordinary sophistication, the invention of an alternative storage technology may not be a priority. This is not to say that writing is not useful or that Aboriginal Australians would not have benefited from it in some respects. It is to say that the absence of writing is not, by itself, evidence of intellectual limitation. It is evidence of different needs being met by different means. The question should not be, why did Aboriginal Australians not develop writing? The question should be, what did they develop instead, and how well did it work? And the answer to that second question, as we have seen, is something extraordinary. The question of why Aboriginal Australians did not develop writing is, in this light, a question built on an assumption that needs to be examined. The assumption is that writing is the natural endpoint of sophisticated information management, but the Aboriginal Australian case demonstrates that it is one endpoint, one solution to the problem of transmitting knowledge across time. Not the only one, and not necessarily the superior one across all timescales and all conditions. As we approach the end of this journey, there is something that has been present throughout, but needs to be said directly. Everything we have discussed, the genetics, the archaeology, the oral traditions, the astronomical observations, the land management knowledge, all of it is real. All of it is documented. All of it is the product of serious research conducted by qualified scientists in peer-reviewed contexts. None of it is speculation in the pejorative sense, and none of it requires extraordinary claims. What it requires is only that we take seriously the implications of what the evidence actually shows. A 65,000-year bloodline is not speculation. It is the finding of genetic research published in leading journals. Oral traditions that preserve accurate accounts of geological events from 12,000 years ago are not speculation. They are the finding of cross-disciplinary research published in peer-reviewed journals. Astronomical traditions that contain accurate data about stellar variability are not speculation. They are the finding of researchers who have compared traditional astronomical accounts against modern measurements. An aquaculture system 6,600 years old is not speculation. It is the UNESCO-inscribed reality at Bujbim. A genetic signal connecting Amazonian populations to Australasian ancestry is not speculation. It is the finding of a 2015 paper in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. All of this is real, and yet most of it is unknown outside the academic communities that produced it. Most people who go through standard education anywhere in the world will not encounter any of this material in a systematic way. They will learn that Aboriginal Australians are one of the world's indigenous cultures. They may learn that they are very old. But the specific content of what that age means and what the evidence for it shows will not be part of their education. This is a failure, not a malicious one. Simply a failure of the systems through which knowledge about the human past gets transmitted to the general public. The academic research exists, the documentation exists, the evidence exists. The translation of that evidence into public knowledge has not happened at the scale that the significance of the evidence demands. That is part of what conversations like this one are for, to take the evidence seriously, to describe it accurately and in full, to allow the picture that emerges from that evidence to be seen by the people whose understanding of the human past it should be shaping. Because the picture that emerges is not just interesting academically, it is relevant to how we understand ourselves as a species. It is relevant to how we think about what civilization means. It is relevant to how we approach the ecological and social challenges that the current dominant civilizational model is producing. It is relevant to how we think about knowledge and memory and the capacity of human culture to maintain itself and transmit itself across deep time. The oldest bloodline on Earth is carrying answers to questions we are only now learning to ask. The people of that bloodline have been here for 65,000 years. They are still here. The knowledge they carry, diminished by 250 years of disruption but not destroyed, is one of the most valuable intellectual resources on Earth. The least we can do is pay attention. There is something that has not been said yet, and that the science alone cannot fully say. something that exists in the space between the data points and the oral traditions and the genetic sequences. Something that becomes visible only when you step back from all the specific evidence and look at the whole picture from a distance. What that picture shows is a kind of faithfulness. Faithfulness to place. For 65,000 years, a people stayed connected to a specific landmass and developed a relationship with it that is without parallel in the human story. Not because they could not leave. The navigational capacity that brought them to Australia in the first place was sufficient to have taken them further. But they stayed. They went deep instead of wide. They invested 65,000 years in understanding one place rather than spreading across the world. Faithfulness to knowledge, generation after generation, across challenges and disruptions and changes that would have broken the transmission chain in any less robust cultural system, the knowledge was passed forward. The coastal flooding accounts, the stellar observations, the locations of water in the desert, the songs of the songlines. Nothing was treated as disposable. Everything was maintained. Faithfulness to each other, the structures of ceremony and kinship and obligation that maintained the culture across 65,000 years are structures of mutual responsibility, of people being responsible for each other's survival and for each other's knowledge, of a web of obligation that extended across the entire continent through the songline networks. These are not small things. They are, in fact, the most fundamental things. The things that any civilization, any community, any family depends on for its survival across time. And they were practiced for 65,000 years by the people who carry the oldest bloodline on Earth. Whatever else we say about what is in that bloodline, whether we are talking about the Denisovan ancestry, or the ghost lineage, or the population Y signal, or the preserved geological memories, or the astronomical traditions, what runs through all of it is this faithfulness, this investment in continuity, this refusal to let the chain break. That is what should not be possible. Not by the standards of anything we know about how civilizations survive across time. Not by the standards of what written history has shown us about the fragility of knowledge and culture and connection. And yet it happened. For 65,000 years. The oldest bloodline on Earth is still running. Let us end where we began. At the beginning. 65,000 years ago, a group of people pushed a boat into the water somewhere in the islands between Southeast Asia and what would become Australia. We do not know exactly where. We do not know how many there were. We do not know what they called themselves or what language they spoke or what they were thinking, as the land they were leaving shrank behind them and the open water spread out ahead. We know they crossed it. We know they arrived. We know that when they pulled their boats up onto the beaches of Sahul, they were the first humans to stand on that land, and we know that they stayed. What happened next is the longest continuous human story on Earth. People spread across the continent, learning its geography, its ecology, its patterns. They encountered the giant animals of the Pleistocene and learned how to hunt them and what it meant for the landscape when they were gone. They survived the deepest cold of the last ice age, when the interior turned to semi-desert and the glaciers of the southern ranges cut off the rich coastal lowlands. They watched the sea rise and swallow the land where their grandparents had walked, and they incorporated that memory into their songlines so that the loss would not be forgotten. They looked at the stars for 65,000 years and built a calendar from the dark spaces between them. They sang the landscape into existence in a form that could be carried in human memory across hundreds of generations. They buried their dead with red ochre and ceremony when the concept of ceremony was new to our species, and death was still something we were learning how to face. They built an aquaculture system in stone before the pyramids were dreamed of. They managed a continent's ecology with fire before any other culture had conceived of land management. They preserved accurate geological information across timescales that make the entire written record of human civilization look brief. They encountered strangers from across the sea and absorbed what was useful without losing who they were. They survived the arrival of the dingo and incorporated it into their world. They traded and moved and carried knowledge and ceremony along routes that connected the entire continent in a living network of obligation and relationship. And then the colonists came. And everything changed in ways that 65,000 years of adaptation had not prepared for, because nothing in 65,000 years had been designed to destroy the mechanisms of cultural transmission themselves. But the bloodline continued. The songlines continued, in the minds of the people who carried them. The astronomical traditions continued, passed between elders and initiated people in the surviving ceremonial systems. The ecological knowledge continued, in the hands of the custodians who still live on their country and who still practice what their ancestors practiced. And the genetics continued, reading out in every cell of every Aboriginal Australian body alive today, carrying the deep record of 65,000 years of presence and survival and adaptation and knowledge. That record, the oldest bloodline on Earth, is still here, still speaking, still carrying the things inside it that should not be possible by any measure of what most people know about human history. The impossible bloodline is real, and it belongs to a people who have never stopped knowing exactly who they are. If you have stayed this long, drifting through 65,000 years of the deepest human story on Earth, then you understand now something that most people will never pause long enough to consider. The oldest bloodline is not a museum piece. It is not a curiosity from a chapter of history that ended. It is alive. It is in living people, on a living continent, with a living relationship to land that no other human tradition has maintained for anywhere near as long. When you close your eyes tonight and let this settle, let it settle into something larger than facts and dates and genetics papers. Let it settle into the understanding that our species is older and stranger and more extraordinary than the version we were given. That 65,000 years of unbroken human presence is the most remarkable achievement in our history, and that the people who achieved it are still here. The stars they watched are the same stars above you now. The questions they asked around fires older than civilization are the same questions we are still asking. Who are we? Where did we come from? How do we hold on to what matters across the long, eroding dark of time? They found an answer, not perfect, not permanent, but an answer that lasted 65,000 years and is still holding. So as your eyes grow heavy, remember this. Somewhere on a continent older than most of the Earth's surface rocks, in country that has been sung into memory for longer than agriculture has existed, there are people who carry the oldest bloodline on Earth, who walk the same land their ancestors walked 65,000 years ago, who still know the songs. The oldest story was never lost, and it was never finished. The bloodline continues, and so does the story. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is.